Merci beaucoup. Bonjour à toutes.
Thank you very much. Welcome to you all. I know that some of you might not have gotten here yet, but our speakers have time constraints, so it would be too bad waiting for all the people who are still at the Security Council. I'm very, very happy to have the opportunity to open up this conference. It's a very, very important conference by the FERN, the Forest People Program, and Client Earth, and of course with Fiona Hall, my colleague, who is working with us on a series of subjects that have to do with the environment, with energy, and a lot of other themes. Quite a lot of cooperation and complicity between us. Of course, it is not. I am not going to teach you about how important forests are, how important that debate is today. And this is one of the reasons why it's so important that we have with us the Commissioner Peebles, who is in charge of development and who will tell you in a few minutes, even though he will have to leave before 2:30, he will tell you about the position of the Commission with regards to FLECTI and several agreements that Europe has been negotiating, what the first feedback is that the Commission has gotten about these agreements, and we'll have a debate with you as well to see how we can improve these agreements, potentially, what kind of feedback you can bring us about these agreements and how these agreements go together with other necessary tools for the protection of forests. Deforestation represents about 20% of climate change. It's half of biodiversity when you talk about rainforests, and we know how much, how many people are concerned by that issue. It's about their way of life. It's about climate, biodiversity, economy, ways of life, and the development of quite a lot of countries as well. So 10 years ago, when the European Commission followed a recommendation of the G8 to start the FLECTI process, it really was great hope for us to be able to, if not to end, at least to reduce illegal timber trade. And that's exactly the objective that FLECTI is after. And of course, I think that will be part of our discussion as well. You can't you must make the difference between legal trade and sustainable forestry. These are two things that are at stake, that sometimes complete one another, but that are not always equivalent. As for me, in the International Trade Commission, my role was to report about two partnership agreements, VPAs, about Cameroon. In Cameroon and in Congo. And in this report by the European Parliament, the European Parliament could say yes or no, give a green light or no to the agreement negotiated by the European Commission. But this subject was very important to us, and we decided to talk to the European Commission about 2 or 3 particular aspects of these agreements that I'm going to tell you more about right now, so that the Commissioner may maybe think about potential questions. So first of all, the participation of civil society stakeholders in local communities, from local communities, participation of trade unions, of environment organizations, whether from the north or from the south, to the negotiations, but also to the implementation of these agreements. And our worry was really to make sure that these organizations, once the negotiation process was over, to really make sure that these organizations would be able to keep intervening, to keep their role in the implementation, and potentially, especially in countries where all freedoms are not always guaranteed, might have the opportunity to complain at the level of the agreement or with outside parties to make sure that their complaints would be heard. We also wished, and I believe that we have not managed to have that wish fulfilled as yet, we wanted the European Commission to have regular presentation with the European Parliament about the negotiations as well as the implementations of these VPAs. There are quite a lot of you here today. It's wonderful news. You have a lot of stakeholders, witnesses of these agreements in the countries concerned, and I believe that we are going to have a very rich exchange this afternoon, dialogue, and I'm going to leave the floor to Fiona Hall, who is going to give you a short introduction to this conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Yannick, for a very comprehensive overview of the process. Before we move on to start the discussion with our key speaker, Commissioner Piebalgs, I would just like to pick up on one or two points that Yannick mentioned. The bad effects of illegal logging are multiple in terms of climate change, in terms of biodiversity, but also in terms of the loss of money to the economies of the countries concerned. It's estimated that about 10% of the world timber trade is illegal, and that actually amounts to about $15 billion worth for developing countries each year. That's money that would otherwise be used for health and education. And if we can manage to tackle the problem of illegal logging, we are addressing a whole range of issues, and not least of them also conflict, because illegal logging, as illegal extraction of other raw materials, has fueled many conflicts, especially in Africa. The EU Action Plan for Forest Law Enforcement, Governance and Trade that was put in place 10 years ago has a number of aims. One of these is to actually improve forest governance in the countries themselves. And sometimes the comment has been made that these voluntary partnership agreements are being made in countries which do not have a perfect record as far as human rights are concerned, as far as law enforcement in general are concerned. But I think that one thing that FLEC does is provide a process which actually helps to build capacity in good governance in those countries. And so, as well as the end product of putting in place a system that means that illegal timber is not exported, it also is in itself a way of strengthening the governance of the country. And I think that that's something very important to bear in mind, especially because it means you can't expect instant results. It is a process, and often the countries concerned are in a complicated situation and do have some way to go. But the very fact that these voluntary partnership agreements are being developed is in itself part of the process of moving to good governance. A second point is that, of course, the timber that then is exported from those countries is certified as being legal. And you might say, well, as far as we're concerned in the EU, haven't we moved beyond that now? Because we passed legislation a couple of years ago to say that illegally logged timber could not be placed on the market in the EU. But the huge advantage of the voluntary partnership agreements is that those countries that are signatories to the partnership agreements have actually committed not to export illegally logged timber anywhere. So even if their timber is not going to an EU country and is going to somewhere else in the world, China, of course, is a major importer of timber, then the fact of the voluntary partnership agreement means that there is some guarantee that that timber has been obtained in a good fashion. Finally, the other point I would just make is that as a process, the voluntary partnership agreements have been a way of bringing people together and getting away from the process by which policy on forestry was something that was imposed by the government in a top-down way. because there's a lot of consultation involved with civil society and with local communities. What is at best coming out of these voluntary partnership agreements is actually a process of inclusion in which communities become part of the effort, part of the pathway to making sure that timber isn't logged illegally. And I think that I would just like to take this opportunity to say thank you to the various NGOs present here, and particularly to Fern, for the work that they have done with local communities to make sure that these voluntary partnership agreements are put in place in a way which is inclusive and make sure that all the people concerned are actually given a voice in the process. That's all that I'm going to say now, and I would like to just mention a technical point, a housekeeping point, which the chairman has pointed out to me, that if you want to listen in another language, English on the headphones is on channel 2, et le français c'est canal 3. And I would like now to pass on to the Commissioner. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you, Fiona, and honourable members of the European Parliament, guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I really would like to thank Fiona and Yannick for making this event. Actually, about the forest in recent times, I have been perhaps less focused on illegal training, but in some other issues, particularly for oil drilling in some of the protected areas. And so it is definitely a lot of aspects, and I will come to the end of the question Yannick has put to me, how we see what instruments actually are necessary really to protect forests, and where we are moving better and where perhaps we are moving not so good. But I especially appreciate support for the Parliament about last year during the ratification process for the voluntary partnership agreements with Congo and Cameroon. I would like to start by making clear that illegal logging, in my opinion, has the most devastating impact today on some of the world's most valuable remaining forests and on the people who live in and from these forests. Billions of euros are lost every year, the livelihoods of millions of people are affected, and basically we are all affected. Illegal logging contributes to the deforestation and forest decline that has knock-on effects on climate change and biodiversity, as Yannick very elegantly put on. In fact, 1.3 billion of the world's poorest also depend on forests for their livelihood. At the same time, we lose 13 million hectares of forest each year. And even if the speed of loss of the forest in latest year are going down, it's still going down. It's also a particular responsibility of the EU because European Union is one of the biggest global markets for timber products, and as such we are both part of the problem and part of the solution. This is why the EU has taken the lead in the global fight against illegal logging and especially illegal timber imports into Europe. In 2003, the European Union has adopted a new approach set out in the FLEGT Action Plan, which aims to blend action in Europe with actions in timber-producing countries to fight against illegal logging, thus tackling both demand and supply. This foresees support to timber-producing developing countries, development of licensing systems to check what is imported into Europe, support to the private sector to promote tailor-made business solutions, work on financing measures to encourage responsible investments, and new domestic policies to promote legal and sustainable produced products in European government's purchasing practices. 10 years on, we see very positive developments as well as the very real challenges of putting new systems and approaches into practice. We have started a new approach to development framed in formal international treaties with partner countries known as a flagged voluntary partnership agreement and reinforced through EU-wide legislation. To date, 6 voluntary partnership agreements have been concluded, 7 are in negotiations, and we are glad that more countries are expressing interest. Like most good ideas, the voluntary partnership agreement is actually a very simple one. A country sends its timber to the EU with evidence that reassures the consumer that it has been legally harvested. The negotiations have reminded us that reality is more complex. Causes of illegality are complex, forest trade and governments touch on many policies and laws, interests in forest resources are multiple and sometimes conflicting. Only tailor-made, country-by-country solutions that match the expectation of all national stakeholders are appropriate. As trade agreements, the voluntary partnership agreements have afforded a powerful lever to bring stakeholders around the table and to identify and tackle difficult forest governance challenges. The process can bring improvements to legal frameworks, securing rights, better law enforcement, introducing transparency that will in turn facilitate monitoring by civil society and encourage greater accountability, as well as ensuring the European market is supplied with legally harvested timber and derivative products. Through the voluntary partnership agreements, we have renewed our policy dialogue. Already, the VPAs has fostered positive processes, encouraging stakeholder engagement, securing law reform, putting in place systems to combat corruption, and also building the capacities of administrations, private operators, and civil society in developing countries, which is so essential for sustainable development. Well, I will quote from Fred Pearce, who will speak after me, has put in his report that he produced for Fern. Progress is being made by the VPAs in encouraging forest reform and improved social justice in forests. It suggests that while progress has not been universal, and forest exploiters are adept at finding the weakest link in any form of governance, the VPAs are succeeding. They are unique initiatives in governance. By providing a key to unlock wider actors in civil society, they offer a template for better governance far beyond the forests. That is why I am so enthusiastic about FLEGT. If used in correct way, they are also central piece in the puzzle to fight poverty, because it increases the chances for good governance. And it's not only for forests, but basically all across the board. Thus, the VPAs hold great promise to improve accountability and contribute to countries' economic growth. But as always, such results rest on their effective implementation. And we enter this critical stage now. The first licenses are expected in 2030. The forthcoming entry into application of the EU timber regulation in March 2013 will bring chances to businesses in Europe, changes to businesses in Europe and beyond, encouraging operators to know their supply chains and to make sure that they are purchasing legally produced goods. This will reinforce the efforts of developing country governments and stakeholders who want to see their laws and rights respected. All these efforts contribute to our vision of sustainable and sound forest stewardship, where the sector contributes to economic growth and development, where illegal timber trade is stopped and global markets are no longer affected by this unfair trade. I would like to emphasize, for lasting results, our common work must continue. Together with Member States and the European Parliament, the European Commission is committed to continue its support through the implementation of the FLEGT Action Plan. We need to do this in partnership, producing and consuming countries, with businesses in Europe and in developing countries, with civil society and NGOs, who have proved to be indispensable partners here in producing countries. And Fern has been one such partner. We greatly appreciate your commitment to giving people having a voice in decisions affecting their lives and their future developments, and look forward to further collaboration with you in the future. You have done through a project called Strong Seat at the Table, where you have helped forest-dependent people to gain and use their rights in connection with the voluntary partnership agreement negotiations. Saying said this, definitely flagged being, well, I would say the most important process that I believe that stops illegal exploitation of the forest at a commercial scale is definitely not the unique instrument. And I would believe that the European Parliament have recently given very important consideration on the Commission proposal on the transparency of the investments. I mean project by project reporting also in forestry, in logging. Because that is, well, the big companies should disclose, even if it's legally produced, but that the money plays for the people. So that, I think, also increase stakeholder involvement. Then there is also the issues that we are trying to address through policies that also affect forests. As you know, the Commission is putting a lot of effort of sustainable energy for all. There are many reasons for why it's a good initiative. But one is the reason that what affects me most in a lot of countries is charcoal. And people are producing charcoal not because they would like to produce the charcoal, but because there is no other alternative source of energy. And I believe we should take into account, definitely it affects less than illegal logging, but that is, I think, one of the side effects that we would expect from sustainable energy for all, that if people have access to clean energy, they don't need really to cut forests to produce a charcoal. And then also our willingness now to very much focus on sustainable agriculture, because that is also part of the challenge, because poor people go there not only because they would like to come to cut the forest, but also to just to survive and get the use of the land. If we invest in sustainable agriculture, support irrigation, and land recycling, definitely we will have less pressure on the forest. So you can't just protect automatically the forest. But there are new challenges coming, like drilling of oil wells. That, I think, is a new challenge, and we need to think how to consider it. And I believe that it is part of our political dialogue, because basically incomes from sustainable management of the forest, I think, gives the government by far more than one oil well, where perhaps the profit in short term is immediate, immense, but the damage done is actually outweighs what the country could get for sustainable management of the forest. Because the forest is a blessing and it should be protected. And where I believe we have not, at least I, in my understanding, have not expected too much of it, it's from RED. Because you ask about RED, I don't feel too much impact of this initiative in our work. We have some contacts with industry, but I don't feel that at this stage it really gives sufficient contribution. But coming back, FLAGT is definitely a flagship initiative. And I believe that what we have done is a good start, but a lot of more should be done. And I'm very much looking what Fred has to say, because it's really good that we have independent evaluation, what's going on, what's not going on. And I believe such a type of meetings are very, very helpful, where we should strengthen our effort and which new challenges we need to address. Thank you very much.
Merci, Monsieur le Commissaire.
Thank you to you, Commissioner. We have decided just before we got started with this conference to slightly change the agenda so that you would have time to put questions to the Commissioner. I'm sure you do have many questions. or if not questions, comments. Can I invite you to be short enough so we can have something like 10 different speakers, and so the Commissioner can answer before he's got to leave us. So, who would like to take the floor to shoot the first one?
Alors, soit le commissaire a été
So either our Commissioner has been crystal clear and has been in a position to answer to all your queries. I'm somehow doubtful. I'll start with a question myself. We were wondering whether within the framework of those agreements it was possible to know who were the European players acting in those countries in the forestry sector, because we do know that there is a real stake of the quality of the players out there if we want to have a genuine traceability, and if we want to have low-abiding companies, that's also environmental impact and social impact, and all this got to be checked. So do you have a link with investments? So do you know who from the European point of view would be the players taking positions out there for those countries where agreements are being signed?
Because it shouldn't be too much secret, but I believe the transparency regulation is crucial for it, because then we will know also what it's all about. Because, well, what if I get a list of companies involved? It doesn't help me too much, actually. I need to know the volumes and the scales. It's the same also with the people of these countries. So I think that is crucial, that we adopt the legislation as soon as possible. And Parliament has made a very good case. I hope that the Council will not stay where it is, that's for sure. It goes at least for what the Commission has proposed, but it's crucial that we have very ambitious adoption of it, because that will change, that will make sense what you are asking, because then we will know what we are talking about, the scale, and definitely the operations that companies are making in the countries.
Je vais donner la parole à Saskia.
I'll give the floor to Saskia. As I just told you, unfortunately the Commissioner needs to leave us before 2:30. So if you have a message you want to get across, please do so. Of course, the whole team is going to stay behind, but it's always better if he hears it from the horse's mouth.
Thank you much for your presentation. We are very, very grateful for what you said. The question is the following. You made the comment that unfortunately there is not much result to be seen on the ground of the RED programs and projects going on everywhere. Unfortunately, I agree with that assessment. Still, we do see a lot of money from DG Development going to different forms of RED, to the World Bank FCPF, to UN RED, to projects on the ground. And we also realized for effective implementation of the FLEG program, a lot of financial resources will be needed, particularly for monitoring the implementation and particularly the monitoring by civil society organizations of the implementation. Do you think we can see a shift in funding from the Commission slowly from RED to FLEG, or is that too early to say?
Well, I have not report how RED is really working. Perhaps I'm wrong, perhaps it's my just anecdotal experience, but I just don't feel in this issue. And I will ask my service really to investigate, is it really delivering? It is worth that money we invest in RED. Perhaps it's much better to concentrate on other activities that are delivering more. So I think it is too early to say, to be honest. So we need really to evaluate, because the whole RED idea was that you bring also private investment, you increase the scale, and it sounds very attractive, and so I would still believe that in the RED idea, and we should look why it is not delivering, that people are feeling it, because if two of us would say we don't feel it, it's something wrong with the whole system.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. My name is Albert Katako from Ghana. And Ghana is one of the major exporters of timber to the EU market. I was looking at the statistics of timber exports to outside Ghana recently, and I realized that the EU being a major exporting country, that thing has changed, and we now have a lot of our export going to China. And I'm beginning to ask myself, how are we going to be able to change that kind of situation and address the threat posed by China in terms of importing illegal timber and undermining the VPA flag processes? What does the EU have on that? Thank you.
Well, basically, I think, first of all, FLEGT has a part that we support in the national forest management and sustainability. So it's anyhow whatever direction the trade is going. Actually, what lacks on other sides that they accept only legally certified timber. So the only thing that I believe the Ghanaian government should raise this question with Chinese counterparts, because China is trying on is responsible world country. So if this issue will be raised, they will have no difficulty, in my opinion, really to enforce, because only legally produced timber is accepted in Chinese market. So I think they will play the ball, but it is really in the hands of national governments more than EU. Imagine that I am coming to China and saying what they should do, if they would say, well, but Ghanaian government never said to us. And I think it should be fair that Ghanaian government address this issue with all major markets, because the scheme does not change in Ghana. You are the ones that certified that it's illegally produced timber. And whatever market, bigger partner, you just discuss with them. And I think no country in the world will refuse the system of legality.
I'm from WWF UK. I had a question on the point that the Commissioner made around reducing pressure on forests. And my specific question is there a plan by DG Development to be looking in a major way at good land use planning in a lot of these countries in terms of supporting that process? Because there seems to be at the moment so many pressures from a variety of activities like mining and infrastructure and commodities, that you're building up this whole program of deforestation fronts which are occurring now in different parts of the world. And I wonder what the plans were there.
Well, it's true that it's a lot of evidence or reports on land grabbing and also all type of mining activities that makes not only impact on the forest but on other type of the lands. What we have done, because it's more international, and we supported financially and also in all activities the voluntary guidelines for land use that has been prepared and adopted by FAO. And I believe through the FAO process, through Rome-based institution, we could promote this direction. I believe that it is one of the right aspects. Second, as we are coming more, and we are very much would like in most of our partner countries, particularly, I mean sub-Saharan Africa, to be agriculture, food security, nutrition, we will be by far more in this process. And with 6 countries, we have new alliance for food security and nutrition, and voluntary guidelines for land use are in it. Because the new alliance is basically G8 alliance, where you have government commitments from one side, donor commitment from other, and private investment commitments from third. But it should be done on the basis of voluntary guidelines. If we get a critical mass, I would assume that it will go forward. But it's also a lot of issues that we will raise in political dialogues, because I believe that whatever land deals be done, and I am not criticizing or taking a stand, it should be according to the law and transparent. Because that's the first thing, transparency and transparency and transparency. I remember discussion with the late President Meles about some questions raised in Ethiopia, and he fully agreed that he should publish all the deals. And he said, well, it's in lowlands. There is no one, and it's wrong criticism. But the answer to it is definitely it's transparency, because then these pressures also will now come down, because if broad public knows, if NGOs know, civil society, everybody, then you have less of this challenge. You still have, but the scale is completely different, and then we also understand the scale of the problem. But I would assume for a lot of countries, because of the oil prices that are high, there is enormous pressure for oil. And this I don't know at this stage how to deal, because the blocks in DRC where exploration is announced, it's it's going very rapidly. And so it's the explorations and starts drillings and its production. And we are already a bit late, I think, in the day as the international community, really to discussing with the governments that they should consider they should take more time in considering taking these fast decisions, because I understand any country would like to end the poverty. And it seems that for a lot of countries that oil is the answer. And it's more complicated than that. And so I think it should not be criticizing, but really trying to work on governments in involving on more sustainable path, because there are no miracles that you can eradicate poverty with one oil well. So it's not so simple, but I understand that it's not universal opinion.
Hello, I'm from Rainforest Foundation Norway, and I have a question related to what Fiona Holt said on one of the aims of FLECT being to improve forest governance, and I'm just a bit concerned, because in Indonesia there is a process on RED now, which has one of its aims is also to improve forest governance, and I'm just concerned as to whether there are bridges made between FLECT and RED in a country like Indonesia that would avoid having two parallel processes for the country, if you see what I mean. So my question is whether there are bridges made between these two processes when you try to improve forest governance.
The answer is yes.
Yes, okay.
Merci. Mathieu Yela, de la RDC. Si j'ai bien suivi le commissaire.
If I followed you and understood you, you were referring to the role the Commission can have when there is corruption and trying to bring it down through transparency. And when Saskia put a question, which was to know whether the EU, who is currently funding RED, when it's not that successful in its implementation, if that is the case, where we have less corruption, less illegality, why should we not forget about RED and enhance FLECT? Let me take a practical example. I'll take my country, DRC. FLECT is only at its teethering, really, only beginning, whereas in the RED process we're much more forward, and people come up with pilot projects, and then we have these forestry operators who would go for conservation with a RED pilot project. But then for the local communities, land tenure is not really safeguarded, which means that when one goes towards a RED project, or conversely one goes to forestry operation, we see there is a high level of corruption. This is my experience back home. So what do we do with such a situation?
Well, corruption definitely is a huge challenge. But I believe the first rule fighting corruption is transparency, whatever happens. Because that's the first thing. Corruption is possible if system is not transparent and clear. The second issue is definitely that government does not tolerate it. That government persecutes each case when they discover the corruption. And the third is strong judicial system that enforces it, that enforces laws that country has adopted. And in this respect, well, all the issues that we will discuss with DRC Prime Minister, I think he comes on 22nd. We are looking forward to work with DRC and support government in really implementing this agenda. And we also will touch upon the flag. Saying said this, I also have understanding that there is time needed really to change this. So it is important that there is dynamic, positive dynamic. And for DRC, actually, I still am very happy about that there is peace. Well, or you could say in East Congo it's more complicated, but still, I believe it is a huge achievement. We should preserve peace and security of the people, because I think that is the first, and we should be ambitious, realistic, and working with government really to putting corruption out of the business, because it's not just announcement, but concrete policies are needed, and I believe that DRC's government shares my views.
My name is Daniela from Greenpeace Netherlands. You talked about the first vlechtlijsten timber entering the EU markets in 2013. So I wanted to know if you are satisfied with the efforts of the member states to put into place all the controls, the checks, if there's enough resources for the customs and the authorities, if the penalties and sanctions are in place already, and if that is true for the whole of the European Union.
According to my information, yes, I am satisfied.
Hi, Abu Meridian from Indonesia. I just have a question about what's opinion from European Union related to palm oil, because for me in Indonesia palm oil become like a main player for deforestation activity on the field. Yeah, I hope maybe from EU also have good commitment maybe to stop buying palm oil from Indonesia. Thank you.
Well, for palm oil we have followed up, and I think there are, well, a couple of. We are actually, well, trying to change about biofuel policy, because palm oil partially is in this. So I think tomorrow in college we are discussing, next week, the indirect land use change that are related to this, and we will have much more tougher approach compared with previous, and even previous I would say have been very, very tough approach. Second, what we have seen in our analysis that it's mostly less is perhaps EU market, but it's new growing markets that use for cosmetics that actually use palm oil. It's less biofuel markets that affects it. And the answer is again that it is strong enforcement of the laws, existing laws should be needed in Indonesia. And we are ready to support the Indonesian government to enforce the laws that actually exist in the country. So I think we should try to support country government really to addressing this issue, because the laws, to my knowledge, in Indonesia are in place. The problem is application of these laws in some cases, what I have heard. So that's the only answer I have. What else could be done? But it goes beyond my. I think we need to look also for some of the commodities how to find alternatives to it, because as long as there will be a very strong demand, growing demand for palm oil, we will have all the challenges that people will try to use the weakness of the law enforcement of others. So I think it's also to find the research and development efforts that we could find better product that could replace palm oil in the industry. I think that is also part of the answer, because otherwise just demand will push through in places where we will not be able to protect it. And the last point, it is definitely trying to educate the consumers, because I have seen quite a difference in hotels about, as I travel a lot, in using the towels. So, and if I imagine, if I would have known that previous that they change all the, when I stayed more than one night in a hotel each day, I think for me it's madness. I would never expect that somebody would, in his sense, to do this. But now at least you have a chance to put a sign on it. And I think consumer behavior is very crucial, and we are not so much discussing consumer behavior in this, but I think consumer behavior is crucial really to get this environmental point to society, because they make a lot of difference in a lot of areas.
Juste pour mentionner que des membres de ce Parlement comme Fiona et moi,
Just to say that members from the European Parliament, like Fiona and myself, are very happy to see that the Commission is taking an approach on the land use. We had been waiting for this for the last 3 years, so it was about time things would change.
In London, I want to ask a question about Liberia. Liberia has 7 what we might term good governance concessions. It has over 60 permits issued over the last 12 months under a shadow system. And Global Witness and our partners, local partners who are represented here, have struggled hard against anti-transparency attitude from the Liberian government just to discover that these permits exist, let alone where they are or what they're all about. My question is, how does this kind of approach by a government such as that of Liberia, we've heard comments from others about corrupt governments elsewhere, how does that actually contribute to sustainable development? And will the European Commission make a clear statement that timber from these kinds of permits is incompatible with the VPA, should be regarded as illegal, and therefore should not be imported today or after a VPA comes into play and the EUTR comes into play? Thank you.
Well, the question on what we have raised also.
Nous avons également évoqué la question que vous venez d'évoquer à propos du gouvernement libérien. Il faut savoir qu'un moratoire a été placé sur l'octroi d'autorisation. Une autre enquête indépendante est d'ailleurs en cours après la première qui a pris fin. Certes, nous avons rencontré un certain nombre de difficultés. Il faut savoir que nous soutenons le processus actuellement. Cela devrait donner, en tout cas, les preuves du respect des règles en matière de protection du couvert forestier. Et si l'exploitation se fait dans des conditions non conformes à la réglementation FLECT, les mesures seront prises. Mais en tout cas, il semblerait que le gouvernement libérien commence à être à l'oreille de la société civile. Donc, des mesures coercitives ne seront probablement pas nécessaires. Il y a donc cette deuxième enquête qui est en cours. Et je crois que tout cela devrait permettre d'apporter toute la lumière sur le processus en cours.
Question là-bas et ici. Bon, 3 questions.
3 more questions.
Comme ça, après, on peut libérer le commissaire, mais...
So 3 more questions now regarding what we've said about Liberia. This shows that we need a complaint mechanism that is fully independent from the partner governments, or else indeed...
Pays-là. Donc on fait les 3 interventions. Donc monsieur là-bas, vous commencez.
So we'll have the 3 interventions. Can we start with you, gentlemen?
Stanley Obalev, Cameroonian. As concerns the VPA process in Cameroon, which is one of the main players in the Congo Basin, it has been realized that there was a problem before, and there's a process. Will there still be a problem? Firstly, the government, corrupt attitudes, but at the end of the day, traceability, transparency, accountability are still left in the hands of this corrupt government. How can the European Union look into this? Because there is no joint commission between the governments of those producing countries and European Union to bring out traceabilities. Privatization is going in. Most ports authorities, most port facilities are owned by private sector. Balore, for example, in Cameroon, heavy illegal logging is passing through the ports of Cameroon base. So how does the EU sees into this? joint issue of traceability, transparency, and accountability between the producing government and the European Union for a good well-being of the forest people. Thank you.
Monsieur.
Okay, thank you very much. I am Matthew Wale from Liberia, and I want to thank the Commissioner for recognizing the VPA process as a clear rule towards community benefiting from natural resources, especially forest. But my question has to do with Liberia in the EU. Liberia in the EU has already signed the bilateral agreement called the VPA. And we are seeing too much delay in the process. So my question to the EU is, what are you doing to make sure that the Liberian government rectify the process that they have signed, especially the legislators are delaying? And the delay can bring many bypasses. That's why you're hearing about PUP and other systems coming in place. Thank you.
Il y avait le monsieur là, et je prendrai une dernière question de la dame, parce qu'en tant qu'écologiste...
I'll take this gentleman here, and then I'll have someone else here on the other side. Your microphone, sir.
Je viens de la RCA.
I'm from the African Central Republic, and I've been moved by what the Commissioner said regarding land use by communities. We've always been shocked since we are working in close contact with communities, and we've noticed that those responsible, or that at least communities were always blamed for poor land use. But the Commissioner said something that was very important. He said that if those communities actually have a negative impact on these forests, it is, of course, for their own survival, to ensure their survival. And that is important as an NGO working for local communities. What was observed in the field was that those communities, that people born there, never we're trying to demonstrate that they've always contributed to saving the forests. In my village, I can tell you that people have their own crop rotation system, and we don't need all that land to grow our crops. We don't need to destroy forests. And yet, around land concessions, as soon as there is a forest concession, we notice that people come in droves to settle there, to settle around the concession, and they use forest products not for their livelihood but for financial reasons. Therefore, if in order to have legal trade, it means of course that timber is available, trees are available. Therefore, I would like to know what are the views of the EU regarding the impact that forest operators have by settling there, by initiating logging activities that actually brings people to those areas, people that will manage poorly, even destroy the forest. Because after all, we're talking about communities whose livelihood depends on the forest. we, of course, we have to seek other methods to help local communities ensure sustainable development of their forests.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. I'm from Liberia, and happy to directly interact and hear from the EU about some of these things. I will emphasize the question from my colleague, Matthew, regarding the ratification of Liberia VPA. We've signed this VPA now for about a year ago, and ratification is still not happening. We as civil society have concerns that there may be some blockage within the legislature because of individual interest. So I would like to know what support can the EU give in that light. Thank you.
Okay, Commissioner.
Well, on first to Cameroon's question. Well, next month in Cameroon, a workshop gathering all stakeholders will identify concrete measures to fight corruption. We also have funded a number of NGO projects to support transparency efforts. And we will always raise the issue of fight against corruption in our political dialogue with government. So I think that is, well, you would say limited efforts, but, well, that's what we can do because only people of the country could do more with this. On Liberia, I will do everything that ratification goes faster. So also from our side, we will be more engaged and, well, hopefully we will report very rapidly back because I don't know why it is stalled at this stage, and we will make an effort because I think for everybody's interest, there is no question about it, and as longer it takes, the loophole is longer. You are right, so I fully agree. Now I think for survival, and this is a crucial question, and there is good initiatives that could be used if goes well. It is an initiative from World Bank Vice President for Africa, Mr. Diop. But he tries to raise the fund to help the African governments to negotiate extractive industries investment. Because when an African government or any small country's government negotiates with big multinational or even big company, definitely one pays the best lawyers and the other side is not so strong. So as a result, you get a disproportionate agreement for the country. And I believe that the best protection for this should be somehow included in agreement if you give some commercial exploitation. That should be in the legal instrument. So I believe that it's crucial that Mr. Diop's industry is also working for forestry, because in this way you increase negotiating capacity. Because I don't believe that African governments could resist the pressure to open up for commercial exploitation. And that's where I think that the best legal strength for the support of local communities it is, because that's the only way I really see that they are strong if they have strong legal rights. What I have heard it is from the Soto investigation about the rights of forest people, local people in South America. But he claims that basically, formally they have rights, but these rights have been already sold somehow. And if you go further, they have no legal strength in fighting their case. And I believe that is the only way if you have strengthened the legal rights of the community, that they are protected legally, not with lawyers that is just somehow who is they can afford. But some of the best lawyers that country is able to use in making the contracts with the companies that they would like to make commercial exploitation. That I think is the only long-term solution. In short term, I think it is just civil society pressure that definitely need all the time to bring their people and their traditional way of life is being and danger if it goes with the speed like it goes now, and the risk is definitely very immense. And thank you for very nice comment, because I believe it is crucial that whatever we do, we should not forget the people that are living from the forest and from the rural land, and they don't want to change it. That I think is crucial also. If they would say more commercial exploitation, that would be a different case, but they don't want to change, and their interest should be very much reflecting in any legal exploitation attempts of the forest.
Merci, Monsieur le Commissaire. Je pense que vous aurez retenu de cette conférence.
Thank you, Commissioner. So we can, as we've heard, the stakeholders are in favor of the FLEGT process, but they need strong ties with you, and not only through your local governments. Thank you.
Bien. Nous revenons à l'agenda tel qu'il était indiqué.
So let's come back to the agenda, and I'll give the floor to Piers. I suppose you fetched this leaflet on, and is going to present this leaflet to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We've, I think, heard a fascinating discussion in the last half hour. I'll try and add some different perspectives to it from my investigation for Fern into how far Europe has got with FLEGT and with the VPAs and the potential that they have. And I want to concentrate, I think, talk about the difference between legality, the enforcement of law in the forests, and justice for the people who live in and around and who use the forests. Because I think it's that distinction that is at the heart of FLEGT and the European timber regulations in general. And it's a reason why, taken together, they are a really important advance on past efforts, including the US, which has its Lacey Act, also banning illegal log imports. While it's a really important development in forest governance around the world and has real potential. Because what I've learned, I suppose, as a journalist, I've been writing about environmental issues and rainforests, indeed, for 30 years now, is that laws that are not just and are not fair simply won't work, and there are an awful lot of unjust and unfair laws operating in the world's forests, particularly tropical rainforests. But first, the law. There's a global effort now to bring rainforests within the law. Now, that sounds pretty obvious, but 20 years ago, when conservationists were talking about the environment, talking about protecting forests, rainforests, the role of illegal logging wasn't really discussed. It wasn't part of the discussion. But now it's at the heart of conservation efforts. And this is important because it's become, the slides are just to keep you awake, really. However, I'm going to need a little bit of light to read this. Perhaps I'll be able... Okay, I hope you can see them. It's become a way of ending the endless disputes that we've seen over the years between those of us, I guess I include myself, in the rich world, who are concerned primarily to save the world's rainforests and just want to protect them and stop their destruction, and those in the poor world, in the forested countries, who have always accused the rich world of invading their sovereignty, of wanting to kind of internationalize their forests by demanding a say in what happens in the forests. And that dispute has badly hampered conservation for a long time. But now there is, with the talk about legality, there is a new discourse, because instruments like FLEGT and the Lacey Act mean that Europe and North America are trying to use their markets and use law enforcement powers not to question the national sovereignty of the forest countries, but to underpin it, to say, you have your laws, we want to help you enforce those laws, and we're going to use our trade laws in order to do that. And that is a major advance towards good government, because it breaks down that long dispute between the two sides. It brings common ground, a common discourse. But it won't work unless those national forest laws that we want to protect and support provide some justice for the people who live in and around the forests, for the people who depend on them for their resources and for their income and their livelihoods. People in the rich world, in Europe and elsewhere, cannot and should not be seen to support oppressive forest laws. The law must support justice and the rights of forest dwellers. Now, some environmental groups have been saying this for a long time. That's something, just a small operation that WWF was running in Dominica 15 years ago that I saw. So people understand the need to support communities and community forestry. But the European regulations, I think, are really coming in on that side now by supporting a reform agenda in timber exporting countries, explicitly supporting reforms. And that's why the regulations, when they come in March next year, could be a turning point for the survival of the world's rainforests more generally, by changing the dialogue about governance. As we've heard, the regulations will make it a criminal offence to put illegally sourced timber onto the market within the European Union, which is still one of the world's largest timber markets. But it will stand beside, those regulations will stand beside the formal agreements that the EU is negotiating, as we heard again, with exporting countries, the voluntary partnership agreements. Now, these VPAs will help exporters. They're designed to, because they will ensure, by ensuring the legality of timber exports from countries with these agreements with the EU, those exporters will be able to bypass the paperwork for demonstrating the legality of each shipment. In other words, it will be assumed that their logs coming from countries with these agreements are legal. So that will encourage trade, but there's a price to pay for that, if you want to look at it that way, because an essential component of the VPAs is that in return for that, there must be reforms of forest governance. The EU will only sign and maintain those agreements with exporting countries if they include reforms that involve civil society in framing them and include giving forest dwellers a big say, sometimes for the first time, in what happens in their forests. Fundamental reform, I think, of forest governance. The aim of the agreements is to meet the goal set by the EU ministers when they adopted the FLEGT plan back in 2003, nearly a decade ago, to, quote, strengthen land tenure and access rights specifically for marginalised rural communities and indigenous peoples, to strengthen effective participation of all stakeholders, notably non-state actors and indigenous people, in policy making and implementation, and to increase transparency and reduce corruptions. Now, that's a lofty ambition. That's a lot of things piled in there about good forest governance, and especially ambition for something which is ostensibly a trade law. VPAs, while all different for different countries, will cover such matters as setting up community forests, land tenure, ensuring local consent when loggers move in, involving civil society in wide matters about forest policy. They're a remarkable and, I think, an innovative example of using trade agreements to promote social reform and good governance. The role of civil society stakeholders in devising reforms is already, even now before the first VPA licenses are issued, a significant achievement of the VPA process. And for many countries, it's the first time that we have seen civil society involvement in these matters. And we're going to hear more about that this afternoon from countries directly affected. And this matters because, make no mistake, the stakes are high for both forests and for their inhabitants. Properly managed and with the right environmental protection, forest timber could be a source of great wealth and development for many of the poorest countries of the world. But badly managed, forests become a curse, fomenting environmental decline, illegality, social unrest, and even, as we have seen in Liberia and elsewhere in the past, funding civil wars. So these are high stakes. And 1/10 of all the logging around the world, at least, is currently estimated to be illegal. In Indonesia and parts of West Africa, the figure may exceed 50%. The UK think tank Chatham House reported 2 years ago that more than 100 million cubic metres of timber were being cut illegally around the world each year. And that, it said, was enough for logs to stretch 10 times round the earth. That's the illegal logging every year. Enforcement of existing laws can help combat this deforestation. But the European argument, and one I agree with, is that this will only work in the long run if there is justice in the forests for traditional forest communities and indigenous people whose activities have often been criminalised. Without a stake in legality and in environmental protection, they will, after all, have no interest in preserving the forests. They have to have a stake in ownership of the forests. And research just in the last year has shown in a number of case studies and indeed global overviews that local stakeholders are indeed the most effective users and conservers of forests. The idea of local people as the demons destroying forests is profoundly misplaced. They are the best conservers of forests, even better, according to the data, than government conservation projects and national parks. Locals manage forests better if they are allowed. But a key part of the VPA process, I think, is to ensure that they are allowed. Let me give you one case study. It's a slightly perverse one, but I think it shows up quite graphically the kind of issues that arise and how things can go wrong in forest governments, how justice and legality do not always go together, and where the EU in this particular case could be of great value in rectifying things. It's a shame that the Commissioner has gone and we can't pursue this one further, but anyway, it'll be brought to his attention. It comes from Ghana, which I visited during research for this project. This is George Ayisi, head of a chainsaw gang, cutting up a tree on a hillside about 100 kilometres from the Ghanaian capital, Accra. He'd been invited by the owner of the land, a farmer, who would get a slice of the profit from the timber. And his gang wasn't just cutting the tree with chainsaws. They were using the chainsaws to cut the trunk, first into quarters and then into planks, right there in the forest. It was chainsaw milling, an artisanal activity. And I watched him cut the tree, as I say, lengthways into quarters, then cut the quarters into planks, and then his companions balanced the planks on their heads and walked them down the hillside to the road and out of the forest. It was a skilled and painstaking work. Very little wood was wasted that I could see, and there are thousands of such gangs in Ghana. They're a part of local communities and provide a lot of local work. One estimate is that perhaps 1 million people in the country altogether depend on these gangs and the income that they produce. Now, most of the timber ends up in local markets where it supplies most national timber needs. This is the timber supply for Ghana, from furniture making to construction. And yet this entire industry is illegal and has been for over a decade. Illegal even though government projects, I was told, are among its biggest markets. There's a complete failure of governance here. The government says that it has to remain outlawed because the chainsawers, the chainsaw millers are wasteful, they cannot be monitored, they don't pay taxes, they destroyed forests. That's the government argument. And some of this timber gets into international markets, so then it becomes an issue for the EU. So it's a threat to the legality of Ghana's exports, and hence a threat to Ghana's VPA agreement with the EU. One interpretation of Ghana's VPA agreement is that the Ghanaian government should be clamping down on this illegal business because it's a threat. It puts illegal logs onto the international market potentially. And that's what the government says it plans to do. It is talking about a crackdown, and certainly was when I was there. But there's another view, that chainsawyers like George are the good guys, that using local resources to provide local needs, producing furniture and so on, that the real problem is the legal industry, the other half of Ghana's forestry sector. Now, it's not my job to decide right or wrong here, but I can certainly see the chainsawyers' case that it should be them that's illegal and the other people that are illegal. Because the other half of the industry, they're roughly equal in size, which makes it interesting. And their timber take, therefore, is fairly similar to the illegal chainsawyers. The other half of the industry is run by large companies, mainly foreign-owned, based on using heavy equipment in the forests and commercial sawmills. It doesn't supply much to the domestic markets. It mainly sells abroad because the prices are higher. So there are two very different industries of comparable size, but all the research I have seen suggests that in many respects it is the legal artisanal foresters who are the good guys in the forests. They, after all, enter the forests on foot rather than with heavy machinery. They're more likely to be selective in their choice of trees, and they supply local markets first. That surely should be the first priority. And in Ghana, for a similar take of the forests, they deliver something like twice as much economic benefit to Ghana as the commercial exporters. Because there's a whole sort of industry going on in processing and managing and buying and selling this timber. It's good business for the Ghanaian economy, and yet it's illegal. Now, Ghana is running out of forests, and we can't forget that. There have to be limits on how much timber is taken. It has to decide what to do with the forests that remain and to start replanting, indeed. But there is a good case for saying that it has legalized the wrong industry. And that was certainly the story that I heard from countless villagers, where they see the companies, the big companies, as invaders, and the local chainsawyers as well. They're their own community, even though they are technically criminals. So here is the challenge for the European Union and for the FLEGT process and for the VPAs. In the name of promoting a legal trade in timber, that's what we all want, should Europe be demanding a crackdown on the chainsaw millers like George to prevent their illegal timber coming to market? Or should it, wearing its hat for forest reform, another central part of the reform of the regulation process, should it be calling for an end to the criminalisation of these local foresters? More rights for forest dwellers to manage their own forests. There's a clear conflict here. Which way are we going? Are we going to have a strict interpretation of the law? Doesn't matter, that's the law, we've got to enforce it. Or is the reform agenda going to dominate? I don't know what the answer is, but it's a really important question if the VPAs are going to work. I'm not incidentally suggesting that we abandon the search for legality. The issue is how to widen that quest to include the pursuit of justice by ensuring legal rights of poor people to their resources. And that, I think, is what the European-inspired reforms are intended to achieve. May not happen in practice, I hope it does, but that's what they're intended to achieve. That was the declared purpose back a decade ago. So the Ghana story there, I think, shows the issue in sharp relief. But a bigger test will be Indonesia. As we know, Indonesia is one of the last great forested nations with a huge and very destructive timber industry. Can the VPAs tame that for the forest communities as well as the forests? There have been huge conflicts over government annexation of forest land there for the benefit of timber companies over the last few decades. At times, also 90% of the timber exported from Indonesia has been illegally logged. Now, the current president has tried to bring logging within the law and has brought down that figure, and the push has been accompanied by efforts of his government to involve civil society in forest governance in Indonesia. We can argue how far it's got, but they've tried. So the VPA agreement with Indonesia has gone with the grain of this process by trying to ensure both legality and justice. And that's really good news. That holds out real potential for Indonesia. But there are doubts. There are long traditions of secrecy and collusion in Indonesia between the industry and its regulators. And the industry remains close to untouchable in parts of the country where it dominates the economy, in Sumatra in particular, but elsewhere too. And land rights there remain the most toxic issue. There are still pitched battles between forest dwellers and the henchmen from logging companies trying to take their forests, huge disputes about land ownership. Now, to work, the VPA with Indonesia has to tackle issues like corruption and lack of transparency in the legal process, and we've been hearing quite a lot about that earlier. Some people I spoke to in Indonesia are sceptical that this can be achieved. So one long-standing WWF campaigner, a lot of experience, knowledge of the Sumatra problem, said, quote, "I wonder whether FLEGT can deal with such issues. Focusing on legality in Indonesia doesn't always save forests, wildlife, or people." She thinks there's something needed beyond legality. Many say that land reform is the key. And I spoke to Andy Roby, the FLEGT facilitator for the European Union in Indonesia, who certainly took that view. But he was more optimistic that the VPAs could address land tenure issues. He said, "You can't sell timber to Europe under the VPA till you are clear about ownership. If there are disputes about ownership, then that is going to be a barrier to trade with the EU. And if that's how it works out, then the EU can have a real role in land tenure reform in Indonesia." So I can just about manage that, yeah. In places like Sumatra, big paper and pulp companies have a long history of relying on timber from dubious suppliers. So they have to be changed. Now, NGOs agree that ultimately the legality of logging cannot be separated from the fairness of ownership of forest lands. There are tens of thousands of villages that have claims on forests, and the VPA acknowledges their customary ownership, but there is much to do to implement those reforms. Current policy and law criminalizes many forestry activities by communities and farmers in Indonesia, and this has to change if the goals of FLEGT are going to work. Now, it sounds, I don't know, it sounds a tough ask, but land ownership issues are changing in Indonesia. The Constitutional Court earlier this year overturned the presumption of state control of forests, and that gives real potential for communities to assert their rights further. And that matters a great deal because Indonesia is really critical for the survival of the world's remaining rainforests. Just to sum up, these are very early days for the BPAs for the EU forest regulations. It's difficult to talk about the impact of the VPA when no licenses have yet been issued for VPA timber. So nobody can be sure if the new rules will transform forest governance or not. Law and justice in the jungle, in the rainforests, are slippery concepts. We've been hearing about what's going on in Liberia, where different concession models can be played off one against the other, and timber companies are very smart at finding their way around the law, especially law which involve local forest communities. But the European exercise does show that at least one major market for forest timber is interested in creating a revolution, I think I could say, in the rainforests, where both the law and ideas of fairness prevail. And that is remarkable. Let me end on this. We're used to seeing trade agreements in recent years being predicated on concern to maximize the reach of the market economy. But here is one that is at least as concerned about justice and about combating dispossession and poverty as it is about supposedly free trade. It offers a tantalizing glimpse that perhaps could be incorporated into other trade agreements about other key commodities around the world. A tantalizing glimpse, I suggest, of a better world. And I'll finish on that. Thank you.
Merci. Thank you very much, Fred. So we are a little late, and you have had the opportunity to ask questions to the Commissioner before. So I think maybe we should have a series of witnesses coming up and taking the floor about FLECT and the FLECT experience. So I'll ask Nora from Liberia. How do you pronounce your last name? Because I think it comes from the French Bouvier. Boyer. So Nora Boyer from Liberia. Mr. Tivale, who we heard before. Mr. Truong from Vietnam. Mr. Matalel from the Central African Republic. Matamale, sorry. So please come up to the floor.
Please. You want to use the computer? Okay. Nora, are you ready to start, or you're... Okay, so we start with Matthew. Matthew? Yeah. Yes? Could you start? So I will be a bit... I won't be nice, so if you can just try to reduce your presentation to 5 minutes, okay?
Okay. Members of the European Parliament, members of European Commission, NGOs, local NGOs, my colleagues attending this network meeting, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mr. Matthew T. Wale. I am from a community in Riverside County in Liberia. I'm here representing my community, and I'm also the representative of the Union of CFDCs of Liberia. CFDCs are community forestry development committees who are responsible for defending the interest of local communities towards the government and the companies. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the EU for all of its support to NGOs, local NGOs, and the Liberian government for the VPA process. Liberia signed a VPA with the EU in July 2011, but we have not yet ratified the agreement. For us in Liberia, the VPA process has been very important. I want to tell you here how important the VPA process has been for communities in Liberia. The VPA has given assurance to the communities that the issue of logging will now be made legal. We hope the process will now be transparent and there will be no cheating, and communities will get what is being provided for them in the law of Liberia. Just to give one example, under the Liberian forestry law, communities should be given 30% of the taxes paid by the companies. But until now, communities have not seen a penny. We hope and expect that VPA will change that. We hope and expect that because under the VPA, the government will have to make sure companies comply with Liberia's laws. The EU will have to ensure the government complies to the VPA and therefore to its own laws. This is because the VPA is legally binding the trade agreement between the EU and Liberia.
But I also want to tell you about the VPA process. In Liberia, communities have been directly represented in the VPA negotiations. From the beginning, thanks to Liberian NGOs, we were given 7 seats on the VPA steering committee. So we are directly involved in the negotiations with the EU. This was for the first time in the history of Liberia that communities were brought to such a high table. It was the first time that we were given a voice in the negotiation of a legally binding agreements that directly impact us. Community therefore agree with the VPA text and hope that everything in the VPA will be followed by all concerned parties. And now we have fought and been given 5 seats on the interim stakeholder committee that deals with the VPA implementation. This committee, with our involvement, will lead discussions as we go towards the implementation. So we feel we have a voice in the implementation and can make it happen. But the VPA should be first ratified. Until the VPA has been ratified, people will be afraid. Contract holders are still cheating communities. The ratification is very unfortunate for us, as it is at a standstill in Liberia. And I would like to call on all of you to put pressure on the Liberian government, especially the legislators, to ratify the VPA. So I thank you, and I thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Nora?
Thank you. My presentation this morning will complement the presentation that Matthew has given, and I will be focusing on how civil society has been involved and will be involved within the VPA implementation. Okay, so first of all, or secondly, let me say my name is Nora Buya. I'm from Liberia. I work for a right-based group called Sustainable Development Institute. We are focused on natural resource governance and empowering local communities to participate in decision making. Okay, as you all may know, Liberia has been a country that has been into war, but the war ended since 2003, and since then, a new government has taken over, headed by the first African female president called Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. Once the new government took place in 2005, the focus was to reform the natural resource sector, particularly forest, because forest logs had been key in financing the war, and hence the United Nations had to put sanctions on its export, including diamond exports. And the Liberia government was asked to reform the sector as a requirement for lifting of the sanction. Following that, a lot of improvement took place. Since 2003, there is some level of reform in natural resource governance, especially in the forest sector. Some good laws are also in place, but the challenge is about how the laws are implemented well. This is the reason why civil society came together and gathered the momentum to ensure that the Liberia government started negotiating the voluntary partnership agreement. We saw the VPA as a tool that will help our government to enforce its own law and address gaps in the law. Because the VPA is a legally binding instrument, the EU, through the VPA, we expected support to the government of Liberia to enforce those laws and ensure that it happened. The VPA process in Liberia had huge support from all stakeholders, And all stakeholders saw this as an incentive for different reasons. For example, the industry saw it as a tool to get better and easier access to Europe market. Civil society also saw this as a tool that will ensure that existing laws are enforced and governance is improved. With all stakeholders on board, the government saw this as a tool to make their life easier to enforce laws, as everybody was on board. And as Matthew has said, community particularly was very involved with the VPA. They had a seat on the national level bodies. The VPA process has also brought a benefit, or has brought benefits to all in Liberia. It has increased the capacity, knowledge, and skills of all stakeholders, including the government. It has ensured that all stakeholders now collaborate more and talk together, unlike before, where there was little room for stakeholders to even agree on problems that were existing in the sector. But through the VPA, we were able to collectively identify ways to address problems that were affecting governance. Not only that, the VPA has helped community and civil society organizations to be more empowered. As my colleague Matthew pointed out, there is increased space now for civil society and communities to have their voices heard and directly be represented in forest governance. Please. Sorry. Not only that, the VP has also started some legal reform in the forest sector, reinforcing our laws, the laws that were existing before, including a new regulation for pit sawing and reforms that strengthen measures for benefit sharing for local communities. The creation of a space for civil society organizations and communities was very important. In the VPA negotiation committee, civil society organization had 6 seats, and two of which were observers, and communities had 7 seats. In the implementation, we also have space on the implementation body. The VPA has also allowed for civil society to begin monitoring of operations in the forest sector. And a program has already started by civil society to start that process. And that's the picture, if you look up the picture of the launch of that program, where we gather media, we gather students, we gather civil society from different sectors as a way of raising visibility of the voluntary partnership agreement and its relevance and how it will help benefit Liberia. And so because we had a say in the negotiation and we have strong voice in the implementation, we hope that we can help make the system work and provide benefit for all Liberians. But with all of this progress, there remains still huge challenges. One, other sectors like palm oil are still taking over land in Liberia. For example, the Sam Dhabi company has been granted a huge amount of land and now has started encroaching on communities' land. So we are asking the EU to check what palm oil it exports, as all palm oil that will come from Liberia, from Sam Dhabi and Golden Ferrum, will not be sustainable. Although these companies are certified by the IRSPO, they do not act in compliance with the IRSPO rules. with the aerospace rules in their operation are increasingly worsening the living conditions of poor communities. Secondly, illegalities are still ongoing in Liberia forest sector. In the last 3 years, over 51 private use permits, a size of a quarter of Liberia's land, was handed over to forest operators. The PUP were initially intended to allow individual private landowners to commercialize resources on their land, such as timber, but over 90% of the PUPs were granted on communal land, which is not in the interest of community rights and in violation of the law, particularly the community rights law. And some of this timber is now coming to Europe. The picture you see above is a picture of a ship loaded with timber that's on its way to Greece. Even though the commissioners told us that there is a moratorium, which is true, but operations within private use permits has not stopped. This can, however, happen because the VPA has not been ratified. Although all parties in the government were behind the signing, the legislators in Liberia has until now refused to ratify the VPA. Civil society organizations have fears about this because some of the legislators may have interest in the logging sector and may be blocking the ratification of the VPA. We therefore call upon our president in the EU to make ratification happen as soon as possible so we can start implementing forest reforms in the forestry sector and ensure Liberians will benefit from forest resources it has. Thank you.
Merci, Nora.
Thank you, Nora. We are now going to go to Vietnam to have Mr. Trong's testimony.
Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to express my sincere thanks to our colleagues in Foreign Office as well as the EU Parliament to give me the chance today to speak. Actually, since the beginning, I was a little bit jealous with our colleagues here from different countries in Africa about the space that they have in the negotiation process. Well, then here I would like to share a case in Vietnam which we are working in a little bit different context. Okay, for the introduction, my name is Cần, Trương Quốc Cần, from an NGO named SRD, which stands for Center for Sustainable Rural Development, which is sharing the network of Vietnamese NGOs working on flat tea. So as you may know that Vietnam is a socialist country. So government and the apparatus of government, including different mass organizations, are the major player or the dominating players in all the aspects of the society, including economic development, social aspects, as well as in different development activities. So NGOs in Vietnam has been not officially recognized as the people's representatives, but the mass organizations. So therefore, although in the last few decades, NGO sector in Vietnam has been emerging in response to the needs of societies, but then it has been received very little attention from the government. So in the case of VPAs, it is the same story like in many other international negotiation processes. In Vietnam, it has started since last 2 years, and it's now at the second round of negotiation with EU on VPAs. However, we NGOs at the beginning was totally not informed about the process, but there are only few INGOs who were engaged into that. So in that context, only last year, when we have received the support from Foreign College, as well as the support from EU, for the awareness raising for local NGOs, as well as supporting with the different interactions and interchange between NGOs. So now, only now, the NGOs in Vietnam are aware about the process and also aware about the importance of the VPAs on forest governance in Vietnam. So now, with the support from EU, from FERN, we now able to bring together 29 local Vietnamese NGOs together to form a network called Vietnamese NGOs and FLETI, and in short we call VNGO FLETI. And with continuous capacity building as well as interaction with European NGOs, including firms, we now have the network which can comprise of different NGOs working, have a very long experience working on forest management. Many of them are working with the ethnic minorities groups who live nearby the forest. And we also have a wide range of expertise as the network members. So with that, I think that from the status of not being recognized at all as a relevant stakeholders in the VPA process, we're now able to bring a quite wide range of the stakeholders into the process. And we did contribute to the draft of timber legality definition of the government, and also we initially developed the channels for interaction between NGOs and government during the FLETI process. So I think, in short, I think that for me, the process of VPA negotiation between EU and Vietnam, it does bring a lot of impact to improving the capacity as well as the organizations of NGOs in Vietnam. Given the context that, as you may, I just mentioned earlier, that NGO sector in Vietnam is very, very newly immersed. So we also understand that for the EU, the aims of EU in VPA negotiation is to pursue and to push forward sustainable management of forest. So to achieve this goal, I think it's not only in the goal of the government and the government apparatus, but it's need to have the engagement of various stakeholders, and in which NGO sector is one among the stakeholders in Vietnam. But then, given the context that we are very young, we just have few decades of development for the NGO sectors. So we do understand that we need a lot of capacity buildings, as well as awareness raisings and in different aspects. So we do hope that in order to maintain ourselves relevant to the process and to contribute better to the process, we would really appreciate the continued support from EU, from our colleagues in European NGOs, to help the NGO sectors in Vietnam to develop better and to contribute better to the process of VPAs, and for the ultimate goals of protecting the forest sustainably and to protect the rights of the forest-dependent peoples. Thank you.
Et enfin, retour à la...
And finally, back to Central African Republic, Mr. Jean-Jacques Matamale.
Merci. Honorables Mesdames et Messieurs les parlementaires.
Ladies and gentlemen, members of the European Parliament, Commissioner, members of the European Commission, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I'm from the Central African Republic. I'm a coordinator of a network for sustainable development and the rights of communities. And I'm also I represent the platform of sustainable management of natural resources and also a member of the Joint Implementation Committee. It's an honor to talk here on behalf of NGOs of the North and South, grouped under the network of community rights in general and of the Central African Republic in particular. My country has been involved in the FLEGT process since 2008. It has initialed towards the end of 2010 and signed with the EU a VPA in November 2011. Ratification took place and it is now being implemented. Since the beginning of this formal process and the implementation of the process itself has actually set up a framework that is highly conducive. First of all, the VPA has created an environment, a context conducive to a dialogue between authorities, civil society. It has also resulted in a better structuring of the NGOs and all those involved in forest management. It has enhanced the consistency and has created synergies within the Central African civil society. For instance, it has led to the setting up of the platform Sustainable Development of Natural Resources and the Environment that is part and parcel of the APA FLEGT process, RED and community rights. We've also noted that forest and forest governance and land use have been enhanced thanks to the involvement of stakeholders as well as local and indigenous communities. Another positive impact has been the identification of the needs of legal reforms that are needed, and we're currently working on that, as well as access to information and exchange between various stakeholders. We are working also on the enhancement and capacity building of the various stakeholders, representation and direct involvement of local and indigenous communities in the VPAs, as well as implementing identified reforms. In order to achieve that, political support as well as financial support of the European Union are needed, as well as in order to optimize progress already made in Central African Republic. Before moving to the question and answer session, I suggest we give the floor to the representative of a key player that is necessary in order to have sustainable development of forests. And here we're talking really about the industrial activities. And I'm going to give the floor to André Debord for a short presentation, and then there'll be an exchange of views.
Donc il y a une partie des intervenants qui se sont tous mis à ma droite. Je ne sais pas pourquoi. Parce qu'ils veulent plus près de la sortie, je ne sais pas. Mais,
I don't know why they've decided to all sit at my right. Maybe they want to run away should a fire start. I don't know. I'm joking. Mr. Debord, you have the floor.
Well, I have to be short, ladies and gentlemen. I'm ordered at least by Saskia to make my presentation as concise as possible. In the meantime, the computer is starting. I'm representing the European Timber Trade Federation. My federation organizes about, no, not about, 10 national federations who account for about 90% of the import of tropical timber in Europe. Is it working now? Well, bad luck. If you look at the achievements of the FLEGT, we have to look from the timber trades perspective to what the VPAs and the EUTR brought us. Well, it's a pity now that you can't see slides because I have to read some figures now. I thought that you might be interested in to know what the market share of what the export of tropical timber to Europe is from the countries where VPAs are closed or where VPAs were under negotiations. VPAs are closed in six countries. You know them all, so I'm not going to mention them. But the main part of the tropical timber coming from VPA countries comes from Cameroon, counting for almost 500,000 cubic meters. The other ones, the other countries exporting to Europe are smaller parts, like Congo, about 100,000 euros, Liberia, 23,000 cubic meters. If you look at the VPAs where negotiations are pending, you can see that there are 6 countries, as far as I know, where VPAs are under negotiations. And it's working now?
It's working now.
Okay. While these people are trying to start the computer up, I'll go on. The main country where VPAs are under negotiation is Malaysia. In Malaysia, about 250,000 cubic meters of timber is coming through Europe. Other countries are less important. What you can see is that the tropical timber imports to Europe is about 1,500,000 cubic meter, 1.5 million cubic meter, of which you can see that about half is covered by countries where a VPA is closed. It's working. Okay, perfect. That means that there is a lot to be gained. Now I have to... How do I scroll through it? Was it?
Escape and then with the arrows here.
Okay. Okay. Well, I went through this. Okay. What you can see is the figures I gave you are concerning logs and lumber, sawn softwood. Logs are almost not exported to Europe anymore. It's mainly softwood. What is missing in my summing up, of course, is plywood, and that is very important. You can see that, well, the bulk of the plywood is today is coming from China and Indonesia. China is a main importer of plywood to the European Union. You know, of course, all that China is not a tropical timber country, so all the tropical timber used in Chinese plywood, and that is a lot, is imported from other countries. And as the gentleman from Ghana also pointed out, that creates a major problem with regard to legality. The business in China is, with regard to legality, a bit weak anyway. You have problems with CE marking, with glue, and so on and so forth, let alone the sourcing of timber. So it creates a main problem for the European timber trade to cope with the EUTR with respect to imports from China. I'm asked to tell you something about the FLEGT achievements. I don't want to spoil the party, but if you look at the FLEGT licensed timber, so far it's 0%, and that is the main issue as far the main goal of the FLEGT and the VPAs is that FLEGT licensed timber is delivered. That's important for us as timber trade. Well, what will the near future bring us? I'm told that we can expect FLEGT licensed timber from Indonesia and Ghana in the next year. But my motto is see first, then believe. So the results of 10 years' work seem a bit poor, but you have to admit that the VPAs and the EUTR as well have been a major driver for change. We can see in countries, tropical timber countries, that the development of TLAS systems, legality assurance systems like SVLK in Indonesia, involvement of stakeholders have been improved, enforcement of their own forest laws, and capacity building. What is very important, of course, is that the work done under the VPA, like developing TLAS systems and capacity building, is also very critical for the implementation of the EUTR. We as importers have to exercise due diligence. That means, you all know the EUTR, of course, by heart, so I don't have to go into details, but we have to assess the risk of illegality in the tropical timber countries. We have to make a decision on the level of legality. We have to make risk mitigation measures. These vary from ask further documentation, third-party verification, to until change your supplier if you can't give any security with regards to the legality of his timber. In this respect, of course, it's very, very important for us that in the tropical timber countries, exporting countries, awareness has grown that one has to take care that the documentation delivered is valid and credible. The EUTR is more or less working. It's coming to effect in 2013, and we are coping with it, I hope, in a serious way. But, we hope, nevertheless, that we can see as soon as possible as much FLEGT licensed timber as possible, because, as you all know, if timber is FLEGT licensed, it has a green lane to Europe. We don't have to do any due diligence anymore. Given the fact that the VPAs didn't bring us much success in terms of FLEGT licensed timber, we have to invest, of course, substantially in the implementation of the EUTR. We do that with our own money, of course, but I must say at this instance with the generous help of the UK DFID. What we are doing is, amongst others, coming up with a harmonized due diligence procedure for our members. We are almost ready with it. The draft, I've seen the draft, but it's fine-tuned now, and next month it will be issued, and it will, what we are aiming at is that all the members of the Timber Trade Federations, member of the ETTF, will use the due diligence procedure, more or less same due diligence procedure. We are organizing, of course, conferences, seminars, information, training, because, and it's still necessary because there are still a lot of misconceptions, misunderstandings with regards to the content of the EUTR. We recently launched the International Timber Trade Forum. That is a forum that brings together consumers, federations, and producers federations in order to exchange information, but also to try to take care, at least, that in all the countries in the world using tropical timber and exporting tropical timber, more or less the same regulations are used, like the EUTR, the Australian logging bill, the Lacey Act, the Japanese procurement policy, in order to make sure that more or less the same regulations are used in all over the world. That could be a means to avoid, prevent that timber flows are going otherwise, are going to circumvent regulations like the EUTR. Well, what we could ask the European Commission is take care that the EUTR is implemented in all the countries of the European Union in more or less the same way. There are 27 countries in the European Union, and with regards to the FLEGT, the Commissioner said, well, yes, we are ready for it in 27 countries of the European Union. I wonder whether it's the same goes for the EUTR. In all the 27 countries of the European Union, competent authorities have to be established. They have to control. They have to do the control and checks on the EUTR, on the due diligence procedure. I wonder whether whether all the member states are ready for it, and if they are not ready, the EUTR can be, as we say in Dutch, as leak as a basket. And that would be a disaster for the EUTR, but also for timber trade. We are not waiting for weakest point of entries in the European Union. We like to see that the EUTR is implemented in all the countries of the European Union as strict as possible. Well, I hope I have been short enough, Monsieur le Président, Monsieur le... merci bien.
Ok, merci infiniment.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we're going to have a short Q&A session. We don't have much time left, but maybe we'll take 4 or 5 questions, comments maybe, and then we'll move on to the next panel. Ma'am.
From the Norwegian Development Agency, NORAD. I have a question to the representatives from civil society. From what I hear, your participation has been valued as very important in this FLECT process. And I was wondering, why do you think this process opened up more space than any other process that you've been part of? For example, if you talk about RED in Vietnam or in other countries. What has made this more valid? I mean, the issue of participation has been on the agenda of donors for many, many years. What has made this trigger deeper to participation, opening up space? Thank you.
Yes, John Zeitlin from the University of Amsterdam. I've got a question for André de Boer. I was very interested in what you said about the scheme for harmonized certification of due diligence that your organization is preparing for its members. As I read the implementing regulations, such schemes will need to be able to demonstrate a capacity for detecting and correcting violations of the due diligence on the ground. Could you tell us something about how your organization is preparing to meet those requirements?
My name is Richard Nyirenda from the University of Wolverhampton. My question is related to the first question, actually, about the space that has been created by the VPA negotiations, and it's to civil society as well. I would like to know what you are doing to maintain or keep that space, or rather, what do you think needs to be done to ensure that space remains? Because if we take it for granted, it might disappear. Thank you.
My name is Robert Yan, and I'm from Liberia. My question is for you from the EU Timber and Trade Federation. I understand you are putting together regulations to help you exercise due diligence. My question is, in the interim, will you continue to buy illegal timber from countries like Liberia in the next 6 months until the EUTR comes into force?
Thank you very much. From Indonesia, my question will be posed to Mr. André Boer. So, can you explain more what the meaning you mentioned that give TILAS accepted in VPA negotiation a semi-green line to Europe? How do you define a semi-green line? And then, yeah, thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Je m'adresse à...
Thank you very much. It's another question for Mr. De Boer. Mathieu Yella from DRC. I believe that the Federation has standards and norms to fight illegality. And do you have you seen added value? Will we have added value because of the EUTR? Will the EUTR bring added value? What will change when compared to what you are already doing? Thank you very much. I think we'll leave the floor to Mr. De Boer again, and then we'll have maybe a small overview of the other CSO members to have a small conclusion before moving on to the next panel.
There was a question whether we could sanction members of our federations who do not comply to the rules and regulations of the EUTR and our due diligence procedures. As ETTF, we can't do that because we don't have individual members. Our member federations will have to do that. What we are aiming at, and some of them have already in place codes of conduct imposing on their memberships that they can only use and import and export and trade in legally produced timber. That's one. We aim at such procedures that our member federations do have the due diligence procedure in place as offered by the ETTF and the code of conduct, and members, individual members who do not comply to those procedures will be kicked out. At the end of the day, of course, we are not. That's not the first thing you do. You warn, you fine, you whatever you do. But at the end of the day, members who are willfully and willingly act against the due diligence procedures will be kicked out. Then the semi-green line for TLS. Yeah, well, we are in a more or less interim period. We have, as operator, as importer, you have to scrutinize also documents of legality coming from competent authorities in producer countries. That's basically one of the ideas behind the EUTR. You can't believe, not in all times at least, documents coming from competent authorities in producer countries. My point is that if the European Union is in negotiations with producer countries, financing and making it possible to develop, for instance, SVLK, then it doesn't make any sense that we can't accept anymore that the declarations coming from such an institute as foolproof of legality under the EUTR. At least that's what we think. In the interim period, as long as the VPA is not ratified and there's no FLEGT licensed timber coming from Indonesia, I would say that it, under the due diligence, the due diligence procedure and the EUTR applies then, it will be enough proof of legality to have a SVLK declaration. That's what I meant with the semi-green lane to Europe. Did I go through all the questions? No. I forgot to, sorry, I had to lend the pen from my neighbor. So.
I'm asking if you will continue to buy illegal timber from countries like Liberia in the interim between now and the enforcement of the EUTR. I
don't see any reason why not. In the interim period until 3 March of the 3rd of March 2013, but also after that, as long as there is no VPA ratified and there is no FLEGT licensed timber delivered from, for instance, Liberia, we can go on buying timber from Liberia, but we have to exercise due diligence.
Even if they are proof that they are not legal?
If you prove, if there is proof that's not legal, you are supposed not to import and not to buy that timber. That's quite simple. But the question, of course, is what kind of proof of legality do you need? What is reliable proof of legality as long as the VPA is not ratified and as long as there's no FLEGT licensed timber? But in principle, there's no impediment to buy from whatever country in the world. Could you repeat the question?
C'était est-ce que
my question was about an internal, potential internal system to manage the the EUTR, and what's the added value of the EUTR when compared to what is already in place in terms of managing the purchases and the supply chain. So, because you talk about that a lot, but it shows that you don't have, do you not right now have an internal system?
In English. We have the EUTR, there's all kind of legislation, but our internal procedure is for our members, of course, the most important, because they have to comply to those internal procedures. It adds to what all kind of legal obligations, of course, but in principle, at the end of the day, there are no impediments, apart from countries where VPAs are ratified, of course, to import the timber. There's no customs control whatsoever, so it is up to the importer, the operator, to check whether the timber is legally produced or not.
Okay, next to you, would you start? 1.5 minutes each. Okay?
Okay. Again, there was a question on the floor about civil society, and I think the reason the VPA process provided more opportunity is the process was clear, it was fair and transparent. And to keep it going, we need engagement. Civil society organizations in Liberia and communities will always engage relevant authority so that the space will always be provided. Thank you.
Je prends le cas de la République centrafricaine.
In terms of our CAR, the VPA has been really positive because the EU, through the action plan in 2003, already laid out the basis for an efficient participation of all stakeholders. In this way, the civil society wanted to really commit to the process and be involved in the process, but the facilitation team from the EU really insisted with the government so that the CAR participation would be a condition without which the process could not start. So this situation was clear from the very beginning, and the government could not fight it, could only ever ask civil society to participate to the process. So the game was basically rigged in our favor from the very beginning. So as civil society organizations, we benefited from the experience and from the expertise. And I'd like to congratulate the NGO Fern. I'd like to really thank them very much, because from the very start, from the very beginning, they have been at our side, at the side of civil society in the Central African Republic. And they have helped us organize and get involved in the process. We also have a few tools, a few international tools, such as the Paris Declaration and the Dakar Declaration, with the basis for efficient participation of civil society in a multi-stakeholder process. So, to answer Richard's question, he wanted to know what we are going to do to consolidate our position within that space that has been granted to us in the negotiation process. Well, in fact, indeed, this is a problem that we have to deal with now. We thought that the first thing we need to do as a civil society organization is to really be very professional. And when we are professional enough, we need to be proactive. And when we are proactive, by being proactive, we will be able to be more coherent in the way we participate to the negotiations. Coherence also depends on something else that's very important, that's capacity development. And we are looking to these points. We are thinking about it, and if we do have the proper reflection process, we will guarantee our participation to the process is sustainable. But as I said, I made a little list of what's important, but this all depends on funding, obviously. All of these things depend on finances, and on funds. Without funds, we will not be able to do anything at all. So we need funding. Civil society organizations are basically grassroots organizations. We are not self-financed. We need outside funds to function. So this is basically what I wanted to say to these two questions that were asked before. Thank you very much.
Also, I want to add a quick comment on the participation of civil society. Actually here, again, come back to the comparison between RED and VPAs. I think here, to myself, the text is doesn't mean anything. Even we could see the text in VPA is a little bit more relaxing than the text in RED processes. There are beautiful texts about community participation. But then I think here what is more important is about the serious needs of the parties when they are into the process. I've been observing the RED process in Vietnam itself. There are few NGOs, INGO in particular, to be participated in the process, and very few local NGOs. And here I would like to emphasize the role of local NGOs in the process. I also was also there in the RED workshop in Đà Lạt, Vietnam last year. That time it was not a local NGO, it was an INGO staff, and it was a donor to that workshop. And we could see that the process that time, Vietnam was submitting the country readiness paper, report. And I do see that the NGO's statement was very hurried, prepared. And for that, I think that it's not about the requirement in the text, but again, it's come to the seriousness of the parties when they do the process. Unlike here in VPAs, I could see that in the process, we, although at the beginning we are not well informed, but then later on, I think we should thank to the sensitivities of the EU delegations to bring NGO on board, and also the support from firms, so that we are able to engage into the process at this quite early stage of negotiations, unlike RED process in Vietnam. And here again, I would like to emphasize the role of Vietnamese NGOs, not INGOs. Coming to the question of how to maintain the relevance, I think besides all of the requirements that our colleague Jean Jack has shared, I think one more important requirements here, or I think at least it's true for Vietnam context, that we need some kind of formal mechanisms or formal official recognitions of the government on the role of CSO to participate into the process. So I think only two things I would like to emphasize. That is the serious need of the negotiators and some kind of formal mechanism between to CSO to participate.
Okay, to support what the others have said regarding the question raised, I think the agreement between two parties or the bilateral nature of the agreement gave it some strength and gave it weight, in that there was some expectation from the two parties. So Liberia was expecting from the EU some things, EU was expecting from Liberia. So that created an opportunity for us, civil society, to be very involved in the VPA, because the EU they like to be in a process that was open and transparent. They expected that from the Liberian government, and so we made use of that opportunity. Of course, we pushed for it at different levels, and also to ensure that we continue having that kind of space. We've already started doing that. In the agreement, we we ensure that we were given recognition to monitor the sector, and then formally report to the GIC. The GIC is the body that will consider is the body of both Liberian government, European Union stakeholders that will continuously look at the VPA, assess it, and then make recommendations on how to improve it. We will continue to engage, but we will need support to strengthen the capacity of both civil society and communities to play our own roles. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Donc, je demandais à Saskia.
Thank you very much. I asked Saskia to come to the floor, and she will chair the next round table with Fred Pierce, whom you've already seen this afternoon. André Debord will stay here, and Mr. Katako will come and join us, as well as Mr. Bousquet, who heard it all this afternoon, and he will prove to us that Europe really was active in the negotiations and will keep working so that the expectations that we hear from civil society organizations are not disappointed.
Okay, I was originally going to ask the partners in the panel to give a 3-minute introduction, but considering the time and the audience hasn't had much time to talk, I think we will leave that. Apologies to my panel members who might have prepared a speech of 3 minutes. Maybe you can give it in the coffee break when people ask questions. But I really think it's now time for the audience to pose questions to the panel, but also if there is a question which I think there's somebody else in the audience who might actually be better placed to answer that question, I won't hesitate to throw the question back to people in the audience who might know more than some of the panel. But just to introduce the panel to you so that you know who is sitting around the table. At the left from me is Mathieu Bousquet, who is implementing the EU FLEG program for the European Commission and deals particularly with the countries in Central Africa, if I'm right. And next to him is John Basil, who is also implementing the FLEG program for the European Commission and deals with the Southeast Asian and Latin American countries, roughly speaking. And then to my right is André Debord, you already met, the head of heading the EU Timber Trade Federation. Next to him is Albert Katako, who represents civil society organizations in Ghana, both in the negotiation process of the VPA as well as in the implementation process. And next to me is Fred Pierce, who you have already heard from. Okay, so let's open the floor to questions. Hands, please. And I'll go for people first who haven't spoken first. There's a woman in a blue dress. I'll take three questions and then we go to the panel.
Hello. Hi, I'm Kirsten Carlsen from the University of Copenhagen, Denmark. I have a specific question for Mr. Debord and Mr. Katako. How likely do you think it is that there will be a trade in FLEG licensed timber in 2013? And I'm asking also Mr. Katako because I know that Ghana is one of the first countries who has signed the VPA. So I guess that you would also be the ones who are most forward on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Then Duncan Bragg.
Thanks. Duncan Bragg, a freelance researcher, also associate with Chatham House in the UK. Actually, it's pretty much the same question. We've been kind of expecting licensed timber since 2010, really, and every year we say it should be by the end of next year. So the question is, what's the problem? Why are things proving so much more difficult than we expected?
Okay. Abu Meridian from Indonesia.
Actually, my question is to Mr. André Debord. I just want to know how about the opinion from the industry in European related to the FLEG things, because when I have meeting on Jakarta on March in this year, I heard there is the industry in Europe is not ready to get to receive on the timber with have the flagellation, and because other question also, because I worry also there is the other industry in European they have like undermined about the IUTR, because this also happened in Indonesia, because some company in Indonesia they undermine about the SVLK. Yes, thank you.
Okay, and last one, Tom Lomax.
Hello, my name is Tom Lomax. I'm from the Forest Peoples Programme in the UK. My question is for the members of the panel from the European Commission. We've discussed and we've heard on a number of occasions today about how a key aspect of improving governance is securing the land and resource rights of communities and indigenous peoples. However, the land rights are weak or non-existent in the current laws of many of the VPA countries. This requires a significant level of reform, whereas in practice there are concerns that that isn't going to happen. For example, in terms of the Cameroon reform of the Forest Code, we've heard talk from the government of a toilettage when it comes to reform, and this is hardly radical language. My question is, how can the process of VPA implementation and the EU's role in that implementation ensure that it proceeds, that the implementation does not proceed without changing this status quo?
Okay, thank you very much. Albert and André, can you answer the question? Do you think it's realistic there's VPA timber from Ghana coming in 2013? And what's the problem specifically with Ghana? Why hasn't it happened yet?
Okay. Thank you. For the specific case of Ghana, getting a flag license timber across to the EU requires that we need to have the systems for exporting of flag license timber up and ready. And that requires that we need to have legislative reforms that will support the setting up of the institutions. For instance, the Timber Validation Division that will export flag license timber, a Timber Validation Committee that will supervise the work of the flag of the TVD to ensure its credibility and autonomy, and then barcodes for supporting wood tracking. Then we need to have the wood tracking system up and running so that we can be able to track the flow of the woods, and also an independent monitor to be in place to ensure the credibility of the whole legality assurance scheme. Now, currently we have the institutions in place, but we don't have a wood tracking system in place, and we don't have the independent monitor also in place as yet. I'm not sure they will be ready by 2013. That's my personal perspective, but I think that the Ghana governments need to be in the constant touch with the EU to discuss progress that is being made, the challenges that is being faced, and how together we can be able to address those challenges to ensure that we can speed up the processes for putting flag license timber in the EU market as quickly as possible.
Do you want to add something?
Yeah, how likely will it be that flag licensed timber will be imported next year? Very unlikely, I think. As Albert also pointed out, we are promised flag licensed timber for years already. It's postponed. The last thing I heard is that in 2030, flag licensed timber from Indonesia and Ghana will be delivered. Well, I said this before: first seen, then believe. And why is it so difficult, Duncan, to implement the VPAs and to come up with flag licensed timber? Well, it is a tremendous difficult process, of course. You know very well, if you want to be FSC certified or PFC certified, these are long processes, very difficult, let alone have a process for a whole country. The supply chains are very complicated to control this, to third party verify it, and so on and so forth. My neighbor also explained this. That's probably the cause why it takes so long, apart from political will, probably.
Okay, Fred Pearce wants to comment on why does it take so long? Why is it so difficult?
Yes, I'm agreeing to some extent with what's been said here. The agreements is the easy bit. then you've got to frame the legislation and get it through. You're going to have political kickback sometimes. People suddenly wake up to what's been agreed and don't really like it very much. So people sort of second guess the agreements being made. Sometimes there are certainly cases where I think NGOs have thought that everything was, oh, well, we've got the agreement, that's our job done, without realizing that that was just the first stage of a rather more complex process. So I think sometimes NGOs could have tried harder to kick on. That's hard to do if you don't have funding, and it's all very difficult. But we know from these processes that without NGOs pushing and pushing and pushing, very often things don't happen. And then there are political things. In Ghana, there was a change of government, and from what I heard, you know, the new government was rather less interested in the process than before. So if you've got negotiations that are going on over many years, there are an awful lot of things that can get in the way.
Andre, do you want to respond to the Indonesia question? What does the industry think of the SVLK?
I thought the question was, is the industry ready to receive FLEGT licensed timber, and what's happening as long as the now FLEGT licensed timber is delivered, something like that. Did I understand that correctly?
Sorry. My question is about what opinion from the business in European country for the importer, yeah? But because when I have a meeting on March this year, I heard the industry in European is not ready to receive the FLEGT timber, the FLEGT license, sorry.
Well, that's a strange thing to say, because we are, of course, ready to deliver, to receive FLEGT licensed timber. That's the easiest thing to happen. Or if the timber is FLEGT licensed, that's the end of story for us. We don't have to exercise due diligence. It's much more difficult for us to, when there's no FLEGT licensed timber coming from Indonesia, for instance, then the EUTR applies, and then we have to exercise due diligence. And in that frame, of course, timber coming under an SVLK certificate or declaration or whatever could play a role in assessing whether there's risk on illegality or not.
Okay. Question on forest governance reform, legal reform, which is important. Can that happen in tandem with the VPR? How would we make sure it's not undermining it?
Ok, peut-être, je crois qu'on a entendu suffisamment que pendant la négociation...
As we have heard, during the negotiations there has been a string of possible reforms that emerge and that were put under the title of forest governance. It's true that agreements signed so far are ambitious. They arise from the analysis of the law, the relevancy of the law itself, and the efforts to be made that have been discussed already and are part and parcel of the law. We need to be as ambitious in its implementation as we were in its negotiation. Striking such a balance is not an easy thing, because we have to show that this agreement is possible and that the FLEGT licenses will materialize. Now, I don't know whether the solution we could put forward would be a merge of all the existing laws and codes in a country, or is it to concentrate on what the civil society has identified as a priority when the negotiation were taking place? Maybe this is a question that could be answered by our colleague from Cameroon. Well, in the case of Cameroon at least. Our department, through Annick Jadot, will be extremely careful to make sure that the level of negotiations will be as ambitious as the negotiation level was. So having sound enforcement agreement will be time consuming, because these are ambitious and they have to be implemented, but they arise from the agreement.
Participation, and that's why everybody's very happy with them. The timber industry is waiting desperately for FLEGT licenses, which keep waiting and waiting because it's very difficult to implement them. For technical reasons, we need legal reform, which is complicated, and also for political reasons. As Fred said, there's kickbacks, people have realized what they've signed up to and are not too happy. So there is a lot of pressure needed to make sure that these processes are really going to be implemented, and that's probably what the focus should be. I will take another 4 questions. There's one at the back, it's John. And, okay, John, you're first.
John Huntley from the Forest Stewardship Council. Yes, I want exactly to ask a question about pressure, because from March next year, the timber regulation enters into force. And I'm asking particularly the NGOs from the VPA countries, isn't that not going to create substantial additional pressure to your countries to hurry up with the implementation? Because after that, if there's no FLEGT license, your countries are probably all considered as high-risk countries. So that means that the operators that import timber from your countries will not have a very easy job to convince the competent authorities that the timber is safe. So, I mean, your countries could lose really market share in Europe if the FLEGT licenses are not ready in time.
Okay, there's a question from at the back. 2 questions at the back.
Stanley Obale. How confusing or clear to the indigenous people, governments, like, let's cut the timber, let's go and trade with it. Iroko Sapele, which is 50 years of age, reforestation is scarcely and may hardly occur in those ancient trees. It's being cut down, cannot be replenished. And what do we understand again? Oh, don't cut this timber, the climate, the society. I'm just trying to point out the confusion between FLEGT and READ. Most people are still being confused, more to that, the civil society down there, which might still bring conflicts again. So how clear is this all about? Thank you.
Okay. Fjaya?
Fjaya Lezhnevska from Client Earth. Something that I noticed in the panel is from Andre de Boer. The emphasis seems to be on government and civil society to make the FLEGT licensing system operate. But it was a multi-stakeholder approach which did include industry. I would like to get your feedback, both yourself and other members on the panel, the in-country industry's efforts to try and get the FLEGT licenses operating as well, and also European industry working with those industries in the same way that we see European NGOs working with in-country NGOs. Thank you.
Yeah, Anne Lambrecht from Greenpeace. I have a question for John Basil about what your current thinking is about situations where a country has signed a VPA, implemented, and then it turns out that its neighbors haven't got a VPA, and a lot of timber and timber products get trafficked illegally through those other countries. And I think the most extreme example probably is the Democratic Republic of Congo and its eastern border, but also situations like the border between Indonesia and Malaysia, where those 2 countries with VPA negotiations moving ahead at completely different speed, with one probably implementing it quicker than the other. So how do you look at dealing with that?
Question before?
My name is Imelda from Indonesia. As we know, since early 2000, Indonesia have adopted the decentralization system, where each local authority is allowed to reinforce local rules and regulation, and this contributes to complication and slow implementation of policy from the central government. I would like to know, how can you help assisting Indonesia, countries like Indonesia, in implementing it in more efficient way and less bureaucracy? Thank you.
That sounds like a challenging one. Let's start with the first question. The EUTR is coming into effect in March 2013. Doesn't this raise the pressure dramatically, Albert, in Ghana?
Yeah, it does raise the pressure, and let me just quickly add that. First, there are elections coming up in December in Ghana, and that means that those who are responsible for decision-making are all probably involved in campaigning at this stage, and probably nothing can happen until after the elections. Now, if after the elections there are change of government, then that also have further implications on what could happen and what could not happen. So again, that also increases the amount of pressure that there will be. Now, the other aspect for me will be how we can work with the European Timber Trade Association of Federation, whatever the name is, and on getting them to understand what the laws in terms of legality definition are in Ghana, and therefore which of the companies are probably less risky or more risky that they can be able to work with, and maybe by direct engagement with this kind of companies, maybe we can be able to reduce the pressure, and some amount of work can go on between the two trade associations in EU and then Ghana.
Okay, thank you. Fred, should we not just leave the trees standing and not cut them down at all?
I think that's a choice that governments and communities in the forests have to make. I don't think that's something which the international community can tell them, or the European Union can tell them, or anybody can tell them, nor should they. Those are decisions. There is a conflict here. If you want to chop down the trees, you're going to have fewer trees. Yes, some will regrow, and you can do replanting and all sorts of things. But there are some hard choices to be made. But I don't think it's entirely a zero-sum game. There are better ways of managing forests. There are better ways of using forests than others. When I was talking earlier, I was mentioning how it seemed that in Ghana, there was huge potential to get more bangs for your buck, if you like, to make more economic benefit, and especially community and rural society benefit from using timber if it was handled in a certain way, principally through local community forestry, rather than an industry approach based principally for export. That certainly was the evidence of what I saw. There is plenty of, as I also mentioned, of research evidence to suggest that generally communities managing their own forests do a better job of it than other people, including central governments, and that includes they are better conserving their forests. So it's not a zero-sum game, and I think a lot of this has to do with who is in control of the forests. And from what I've seen, putting locals in control of their forests seems to give better results in terms of conservation and making good economic use of those forests. Should you just leave your forests and forget about them? No, they're an economic resource. I think forests should be harvested and should be used sensibly and intelligently, sustainably, if you like, in the jargon. And my judgment, I'm sure there are exceptions, but my judgment is that local control is generally better.
Okay, André, then there was the question to you. Shouldn't you work more closely with European NGOs, and should the timber trade in the country not work more closely with the partners? But just before you're going to answer that question, I do want to say to Fjaya, who asked the question, that actually the European Timber Trade Federation has been working very closely in the past with WWF, with Greenpeace, and with other organizations in Europe, including Fern, to lobby very actively for the EUTR to come into place. So there has been definitely, the EU Timber Trade Federation has been very proactively working to getting this legal regime in place. But André, over.
Thank you very much, Saskia, for answering that part of the question. To add to this, I'm proud to say that I was the first one in the timber trade about 8 or 10 years ago, signing a petition to the European Parliament together with WWF and Greenpeace to ask for a prohibition on illegally produced timber. Indeed, we have worked closely together with NGOs in Europe for a long time already. Do we work together with our counterparts in the producing country? Yes, we do, at least in key producing countries. It's also a matter of capacity, of course, but for instance, with our counterparts in Malaysia and Indonesia, we do work very closely together in order to see that rules and regulations are applied in the proper way. And as said, it's also in our interest, in the interest of the importer trade, that timber is legally produced and that's documented, that we can that we can exercise our due diligence in a proper and sound way.
Okay, John, 2 questions to you. What do you do with imports from neighboring countries, for countries that have signed, and how can we help Indonesia, which is very decentralized?
Yeah, thank you. Well, one of the arguments for EU timber regulation was precisely this one, that the bilateral agreements are fine. One of the questions is what happens to timber from countries that are not in VPAs? Will there be any controls on that timber? But another question was what happens to timber that goes from a VPA country to a third country, is processed there and then comes back to Europe. And so that basically the means to address that will be the EU timber regulation, which will ask EU operators to have information about where the timber in that product is from. Species as well. So let's say in the case of Eastern Congo, if you have a shipment going from Mombasa of a species that isn't really associated with Kenyan forests, but with tropical forests from Congo, that would already give the importer a hint in addition to the origin of where the timber is from. If there were sufficient documents about legality, then he might take that risk, but if not, he might say this is a bit too risky for me. So, we can't have all the scenarios, I suppose, foreseen, but that's part of the idea of the due diligence concept, is that it will evolve and people will learn from best practice and identify which could be the potential trouble spots. And then the second question on Indonesia and decentralization. Well, there may be people in the audience who can answer better than me on the details of the support, but certainly part of one interesting outcome of this whole FLEG negotiation is that the whole totality of the legislation is seen together for the first time. And then it can become apparent that it's too complicated, there's conflicts, and there's a need for simplification. And so that in itself is quite a good outcome of the process, where people realize that in fact there's a need to simplify and avoid duplication, which I think there's still potential to go further in fact in some of the FLEGT agreements on that. And that relates a bit to your question on the decentralized authorities and their role. But it's taken into account in the FLEGT legality grid, the different legislation which applies and for which the local authorities are responsible. But how exactly those responsibilities are shared between the central level and the district level, or provincial level, is something really which is under constant negotiation, part of a bigger, I think, agenda, not only about forestry, but other resources and so on. So we're ready to provide support through FLEGT, but essentially the initiative comes from the Indonesian side.
Okay, Mathieu wants to add it. Really short, though, please.
Okay, juste 2 points. Two things regarding this transfer between neighboring countries. The signatories actually want to make sure that all timber exported is subject to less. So therefore neighboring parties should ask for this kind of information and provide it to European end users or consumers. That would help us track timber. There was a question regarding FLEGT and RED. There was a lot of confusion in the past, but I believe that a lot has been done in order to clarify the process, in order to create some synergies between these two processes, in order to improve the situation. Therefore, as far as the Commission is concerned, working with the European Timber Institute, we've worked with partner countries in order to create synergies between FLEGT and RED.
If we can squeeze in a very quick round of questions. The chairman, Sandy, can we squeeze in another quick round of questions, or Okay, we have permission to squeeze in another quick round of questions. So please keep your questions as short as possible. Then we can squeeze in as much as possible. And also please keep your answers as short as possible. I see one, David.
Hi. Would the dramatic increase in the availability of information to all the parties concerned speed up the process of implementation of the VPAs? And equally, does a lack of energy in implementing the transparency annexes of the VPA demonstrate a reducing level of political will? It seems to me a simple step, and yet action has been very slow even on this simple step.
Okay, next question, please. Robert?
I'm Robert from Liberia. My own question is about helping me manage my expectation about the EU, that the EUTR may solve all of the problems when the VPA is not in process. Have the Parliament or anybody look at the EUTR if there are any drawbacks? If there are any drawbacks or weaknesses, can you be able to tell us? The second question is to that is that, are you developing the TR at the same time you are going ahead with VPA negotiations? Are timber producing countries aware of the EU TR as well as their operators?
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? Edgar?
Hello, I'm Edgar Topper, a consultant. We've been talking a lot about the VPA countries. I would like to ask about the non-VPA countries. I think Mr. de Boer said that 50% of our imports come from VPA countries, which means that 50% doesn't come from VPA countries. What is the likely effect on these countries of the coming into force of the EUTR? And is there a vision for fostering good governance in these countries? I'm thinking of a country like Suriname, important forest country, which could be affected negatively, I presume, or have a comparative disadvantage after coming into force of the EUTR. Is there any vision on how to deal with that?
Okay, thank you. Let's give the panel the question to answer. David's question was the question about transparency. Is the lack of the making information available in countries not indicative of a lack of political interest? And if there was more transparency, would the implementation not go faster? I think I give that one to you, Albert. Few sentences, please.
Well, I'll say if there's transparency, it probably will help the process. But again, both governments and industries are probably reflecting over and over again on the VPA issues, what is the need for them, how the process can support, how the process can be advantageous to them and things like that. Industry will be looking for opportunity, will be looking at whether the VPA gives them improved market access and all that compared to other markets where they don't have to go through the stress of having a FLEC license before importing. And those are things that needs to be considered. Government is looking at also at the added cost of having a wood tracking system in place and those kind of things. So all these things are things that both stakeholders are reflecting upon and trying to make a decision on the level of commitment that has to be made. But for us in civil society, again, we see that as a lack of political will to really drive the process forward as fast as possible.
Okay, before I let the Commission answer the question about the EUTR, maybe Andre, you can say something about, is the timber industry in producing countries ready for the EUTR as far as you know, and what do you see as the drawbacks?
Well, we recently had, the other week, by the way, a seminar in Malaysia where the people are rather aware of what's going on, but even there are still misconceptions, misunderstandings about the EUTR, let alone in other countries. So I'm not, I'm a bit worried about the level of awareness in producing countries with regards to the EUTR. The same goes, by the way, in Europe. We cannot only point to the producer countries, also in the importing countries, especially in the eastern part of Europe, the awareness with regards to the EUTR is very, very low, and it worries us a lot.
Do you want to answer from the Commission side? Drawbacks to the EUTR, and is everybody ready?
Yeah, thanks. So the EU timber regulation is a product of a negotiation, just as a VPA is a product of a negotiation, which involved the Commission, the Member States and Council and the European Parliament. And as with any negotiation, no one got everything they wanted, but it was acceptable to all the parties concerned. Really, we won't be able to see the drawbacks, I think, until we've started implementing it. So at the moment, it's a bit theoretical as to you know, how effective it will be. I think there have been quite a few concerns raised about how effectively it will be enforced across the EU, but in that respect, in principle, the same argument applies to most EU legislation. In the end, it has to be enforced in the Member States, and there are tools, if it's not being effectively enforced, for the Commission to take action to make sure that it is enforced. And the fact that it's a regulation as opposed to a directive means that it directly applies in the Member States, so there's no room for sort of different interpretations. You might say that one of the strengths is also the weakness, this concept of due diligence, which is a bit of a fuzzy concept. It's not terribly well defined, and people are often looking for, tell us exactly what we have to do, and then we'll do it. Tell us what documents, and we'll find them. And we come back and say, no, it's up to you. You're the guy in the trade. You should know who your suppliers are. And we will never have all the answers for all the timber trade across the world. So we're pushing the responsibility back on the operators to do that. And of course, that I would see as a strength, because it means that they're responsible for their actions, but you can say it's also a weakness because you may not have a consistent approach across the EU. In terms of preparedness for the EU TR, sorry. Okay. It's very patchy. We're doing our best to inform partners, but there's still quite a long way to go. Within Europe, we're developing an information campaign to increase awareness also within the EU, and the competent authorities are starting to work on means to increase awareness with the industry in their countries within the EU.
Okay, and I would like to ask all panel members to quickly reflect on Egger's question before I hand the chair back to Yannick Jadot. His question was, André de Boer showed that 50% of the import comes from VPA countries. We know things are happening there, positive things are happening there, although there's still a long way to get the system in place and implemented, but 50% is coming from non-VPA countries. So how do we strengthen good governance in those countries, and is the coming into force of the EUTR not potentially undermining for those countries, was his question. André, can you say in a few sentences a response to that?
Looking at it in practice, you can see that from Africa, almost all the countries, all the relevant countries for Europe are in having a VPA or are negotiating a VPA, with the exception of Ivory Coast. The same goes for Asia. The problem lies in Latin America. There are no pending negotiations, as far as I know, with Latin American countries, and there is, especially from Brazil, is a major player on the market for timber. Recently, a report of Interpol has been issued with regards to the fastness of illegal timber, estimated between 30 or 100 billion dollars still. The margins are high, but even it's only, between brackets, 30 is too much. And the Amazon region is specifically pointed out in this report. So that's a worrying thing. I think that if FLEGT license is delivered, then it could impose a threat on countries not delivering FLEGT licensed timber, because, as said, under the EUTR, if you can buy FLEGT licensed timber, that's end of story with regards to the due diligence. Makes life of importers much easier.
Thank you. Mathieu, quick response to that?
I think in terms of volume, I mean, André responded. I mean, one of the key questions is Brazil. The discussion with Brazil have been also a discussion on sovereignty issues. I mean, Brazil didn't want to talk about that, but I mean, as was made evident by our colleague. I mean, maybe the question is not that about sovereignty, because with the VPA process, things are a little bit different from another trade agreement. So maybe there are rooms for discussing something with Brazil.
Okay.
Yes, well, I think some countries, I mean, they have different considerations for going into a VPA. I think Brazil, those who know the history of Brazil and its sensitivity about external interference in the Amazon will understand that it basically says we have a problem, but we're going to solve it ourselves, and that's how we'll deal with it, and we'll tell you about how we solve it. So we have to wait and see what their proposal will be on how it deals with the EU timber regulation. For other countries, they're still scratching their heads, I think, about how best to respond, and that's where I think an interaction also with the private sector, because they're going to get their messages from the EU importers about what it is that they think will be adequate for EUTR compliance.
Thank you. Albert, quick question: how to improve governance in non-VPA countries? In non-VPA countries, have you got a suggestion for that?
Right away, but I think that if the EUTR, the way I understand it, comes into force for VPA countries, it will be complementary. But for non-VPA countries, then I think it's another opportunity for them to really strengthen or engage in the legality issues of having legal timber exported.
So they should go into negotiations, basically. Okay, Fred, the last word is to you.
Thank you. I think it's going to critically depend on what happens in the next few months. If the VPAs get up and running and the European regulation looks like it's biting, then an awful lot of countries will want in. And if it doesn't, then they will just shrug their shoulders and say, well, it was another European initiative that didn't quite work, and will walk away. I'm sure that applies in Latin America. I mean, to be a bit more positive, I'm sure it would be quite critical what happens in Indonesia, because it's such a large supplier. But some things will depend on what the attitude the Chinese take. For instance, whether countries like China want to actively engage in having a global approach to banning illegal timber. If the Chinese decide they want to walk around the regulations, then it'll be much harder to get what is really the only way, which is a global system. Europe ultimately can't do this on its own. Nobody's mentioned Russia. What about Russia? Russia produces quite a lot of timber. We haven't talked about that, but it's probably too late to do that. But I think the next few months are going to be critical.
Thank you. I would like to ask Yannick Jadot, the chair, to come up and close the session. But before he gets up, I would like, on behalf of Client Earth and Forest Peoples Programme and Fern, thank Yannick and Fiona Hall for hosting this conference, and maybe we can give him an applause for doing so.
Merci beaucoup. Je vais pas être très long parce que...
Thank you very much. I won't be long. We have a cocktail actually waiting for us outside. But I'd like to thank Fern and Saskia for giving us the opportunity to close that session. Martin and Anne as well. Just a few words still that I'd like to... Well, you can't deal with everything with one single tool. If you try to deal with everything, you always do something wrong. If you want to deal with democracy, if you want to improve the protection of forests, if you want to have a profitable economic activity, if you want to make sure that everything is legal, it's going to be very complicated. It's going to be very complicated, and you are going to have to permanently, constantly, and that's where you need to be very credible, the countries as well as the EU. You need to adapt your answers. FLEGT if you want it to be successful, needs to make it possible, need to give itself the means so that you can enforce forest governments with independent stakeholders, independent from their governments, for example, if you want them to be drivers in that process. FLEGT won't be solving all of the timber certification problematics. You have other issues, the FSE, other types of labels that will also bring some type of answer between FLEGT countries and countries that do not participate in a FLEGT program. We mentioned Brazil and the rainforest in Brazil. Of course, this is an important issue, but we talked about it more than 20 years ago, actually, in 1992. We talked about biodiversity and whether it is a common good for humanity, whether it should be treated as a common good for humanity, or whether it is a resource, a country, a national resource for the countries. And the agreement we signed in Rio at the time was that since quite a lot of countries in the north weren't ready to show responsibility in terms of compensation, quite a lot of countries said, well, wait a minute there, we are not going to say that our forest is a common good, we are not going to lose sovereignty on it if you do not make it a real common good for humanity, if you do not make it possible for local communities to have their voices heard. I heard the commissioner before, and he said countries need to understand that for petrol drilling, etc., this is not a good bet on the long term. Well, to tell you the truth, I think it's a bit easy. It's a bit easy to say that, because if we do not have the capacity through RED, I mean, RED, you keep hearing about RED, but FLEGT as well. If you do not have the ability through RED or FLEGT to help the countries, help natural resources be sustainable, be really protected, help really protect the natural resources, if it doesn't help the economic development, if it doesn't simply serve a small number of industrial manager, or if it doesn't help only a small part of the government, for example, you really need to have people be accountable for their actions vis-a-vis the population, but you also need to have the EU really be responsible and complete their engagements. And we have seen debates at the European Commission about FLEGT and about the means that we give FLEGT so that the tool can be efficient. It's very promising, of course. We have two things at stake here. First of all, the protection of the resource, and another thing is democratization. Through FLEGT, we can see that sustaining democracy in a certain number of countries, part of that process as well. The global north countries generally say if you have elections organized, you're fine. But that's not what democracy is about. That's not only what democracy is about. You need to have stakeholders at every level get involved in several chains of custody. And you need to really redistribute the resources. You need to manage it sustainably. You need to redistribute wealth, and you need to have democratic control. And once again, in this case, the responsibility of the European Union will be considerable when the VPAs are implemented, because for the European Parliament, I was saying it in my introduction, we have asked the European Commission to come regularly and make presentations to the European Parliament and to really report about the negotiations. This is absolutely necessary, otherwise we won't vote positively for the agreements, but we also need to have reports about the implementation of these agreements. Potentially, then, we can also be partners of all this as the European Parliament. The European Parliament could become a partner, and you know, you've got INGOs or NGOs from the global north. We know that we are quite easily accessible, we are quite easy to reach, so do not hesitate, either directly or through spokespeople, to talk to us, to tell us about the challenges that you have to take up in the implementation of these agreements. I know that within this FLEGT process we'll need to have a mechanism where people can complain in case there is a violation, a system that would be available for civil society organizations, so that governments, whether in your countries or EU governments, as a separate instance, as a separate decision-making instance, we need to have a space within which you can intervene if there is any issue with the implementation of these agreements. I'd like to thank you all very much for being here. The discussion is not over. We can go and have a little drink. I'd like to thank all of the organizers, the Fern, and I hope to see you very soon. Bye.